13,000 paratroopers had dropped behind their lines. Now the frontal assault is underway. 150,000 soldiers storming the beaches of Normandy in what still ranks as the greatest invasion in history. The Allies land in Europe. Good morning, I'm Joan London, and welcome to an extraordinary 5 hours of television commemorating that historic day in World War II when the tide finally began to turn against Nazi tyranny. And this morning we are in Normandy, France. I'm in the town of Saint-Mère-Église. That was the first French town liberated by the American forces. And 35 miles from here at Omaha Beach, the site of D-Day's bloodiest fighting, is Peter Jennings. Peter?
Good morning, Joan, and good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us on this day, which I think you'll figure out by the end of the day has been important to so many of us, though so many Americans are too young to have been associated with it in any way. Joan said it was the tide that turned then, and that's why this day is so important. It was not the bloodiest battle in history by any means. There were bloodier battles in World War I, certainly bloodier battles in the American Civil War. But this was the one where the Allied forces managed to regain a foothold in Europe, and it was the beginning of the end for Adolf Hitler. I think it's important, or at least hope it's important, at the beginning of the day we try to give you some sense of where we are geographically. We are on Omaha Beach, and the weather is not all that different than the way it was 50 years ago. Off the coast there you can see, perhaps at the moment, half a dozen ships, including the U.S. aircraft carrier, the USS George Washington. Imagine, if you will, 50 years ago that you could hardly see the water. There were more than 5,000 ships which had left English ports and come across here and surprised the Germans, who were up in positions right about here over Omaha Beach. And the fighting had already been going on for several hours. The paratroopers, as Joan said, had come in behind the lines. There was an enormous naval assault all along this beach on the German fortifications. Not all of it was successful. And before it was over, hundreds of thousands of men would try to make their way across this wide, bloody beach, Omaha the bloodiest particularly, and try to get a foothold again on the European mainland. It was an enormous gamble. We're talking about 50 miles, basically, of Normandy beaches, and we can show it to you really in animation. There is the English Channel, seen first from the north and now from the west. And Utah and Omaha were the American beaches here in the west. And then came Gold and Juno and Sword. Gold was a British beach, Juno a Canadian beach, and Sword a British beach. The idea at Utah and Sword was to get around behind the Germans and prevent them from reinforcing the great bulk of forces that came in here at the center. The great challenge at Omaha and Gold and Juno was to break through the German fortifications and get inland. And as the day goes on, we'll try to explain how the battle ensued, how tough it was, because, boy, the Germans fought hard. Take one more look at the beach before we start. The beach is really quite enormously wide. The tide is about halfway out at the moment. In time, we'll show you what that beach was like with the most devastating German defenses on it. But on this 50th anniversary of D-Day, all up and down the Normandy coast in weather just like this, people from so many countries have come together to honor and remember those men who died, and of course those men who lived. Many of them are here. And down there on Red Easy Beach on Omaha is our own ABC's Jim Wooten, who has been following events so far as to what's happened today. Jim, tell us what you've seen so far.
Well, this day arrived with leaden skies and a fine gray mist, familiar to those who fought here.
I first saw the shore of Normandy through the murk and gloom of a stormy June morning, and it's remarkably the same again today, 50 years later.
Dean Rockwell commanded landing craft that day. Today on the aircraft carrier George Washington, he introduced the president. A sunrise ceremony with very little sun. The first remembrance on a day full of memories. From the sea to the shore, from point to hook, taken at enormous cost by U.S. Rangers, to Utah Beach, stormed by American infantry, honored today by Mr. Clinton and French President Mitterrand. To Queen Elizabeth's tribute to the British who died, this anniversary has moved through ceremony and celebration, through pomp and circumstance, to the heart of the matter. An aging generation of warriors gathered for one more reunion. And at Point de Hoc, the President spoke for those too young to remember.
Here are the faces for whom you risked your lives. Here are the generations for whom you won a war. We are the children of your sacrifice. The flame of your youth became freedom's lamp, and we see its light reflected in your faces still, and in the faces of your children and grandchildren. You completed your mission here, but the mission of freedom goes on. The battle continues. The longest day is not yet over.
The risk on such occasions as this is that the ceremony, the rituals, and the rhetoric will overshadow the reality. But the rub is that the reality is so staggering that those of us who were not here are left with something less. But maybe it's not a problem, because most veterans say a simple thank you will suffice. Peter?
Jim, if our director will pull back just a touch there, you can tell us, I guess, that all this greenery wasn't there on D-Day, was it?
Exactly, Peter. The beach, the sand went all the way up to the base of this rise. The Germans had, including the bunker where you are, at least 8 similar bunkers all the way along this rise, and scattered in between were scores of machine gun emplacements and communication trenches. Out on the beach were Rommel's spaghetti, all of the contraptions that he had devised to stop the invasion on the beach. It didn't work, but it almost did.
Thanks very much, Jim. We'll be back to Jim Wooten throughout the day, who's been here for several days and understands the poetry of this place as well as anybody. From time to time, at our particular location here, you may hear a helicopter. We are very close to a MASH unit, a Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, which has been busy from time to time, so that's what the helicopter is. There were, of course, no helicopters 50 years ago. Now, coming up in the 9 o'clock hour today, this is Eastern Time, I'm referring to the international ceremonies at Omaha Beach, including a reenactment of the landing. You're going to have to push your imagination through much of the day, but I don't think it'll be all that difficult for you, really, no matter how old you are. And then in the 11 o'clock hour, which will be Eastern Time as well, as Joan said, we're going to be here a long time, the very indubitably, unquestionably moving ceremonies at the American Cemetery, which is just up here on the top of the hill. Right now, let's go back to Joan London. Joan?
All right, Peter, the weather has been actually quite similar to the weather of 50 years ago. Weather was actually a deciding factor in trying to decide when to start this invasion. June 5th was scrubbed because of a huge storm, and June 6th was only picked after a lot of agonizing over the forecast of the Allies' weatherman by General Eisenhower. Now, our own weatherman this morning, Spencer Christian, is actually in Abilene, Kansas at the Eisenhower Center. And good morning, Spencer.
Good morning, Joan. Yes, this is a rather historic site also. The Eisenhower Center, as it is commonly known, is a 22-acre, 5-building complex. Those 5 buildings include the Dwight Eisenhower Presidential Library, the Museum of the Presidential Library, in which I'm standing at the moment, the Eisenhower home, which rests on its original site, a visitor center, and a place of meditation, which is General Eisenhower's final resting place. This table I'm standing at right now was the planning table that was actually used by General Eisenhower and his staff during the months of planning for the great Allied invasion. Its original length accommodated some 13 chairs, and this table was in continuous use from October 1943 to May 1944. Right now, we're going to shift to today's weather and take a look at what's happening around the country and then overseas. First of all, today's outlook calls for mostly sunny skies over much of the nation, and particularly down through the plains and out into the southwest, across the southern Rockies and out to the California coast. It'll be a hot and dry day in the southwest, cool and damp up in the northwest with a chance of some shower activity. And in the east, there will be scattered but powerful afternoon thunderstorms. High temperatures today reaching well into the night. This is the famous just-in-case letter, which was written by General Eisenhower on the night before the great invasion. Just in case the Allied invasion had failed, General Eisenhower was claiming full responsibility for that failure. You can see that he was suffering from sleep deprivation the night before the invasion. He dated it July 5th. It was actually June 5th when he penned this note. We'll be showing you a great deal more of this amazing complex as we continue through the program, and we'll take a look at the actual weather forecasts leading up to the D-Day invasion. Peter?
Thank you very much, Spencer. As you point out, it was an enormous gamble, the D-Day invasion. The Americans had wanted to go sooner than the British had, but it was on. Eisenhower, as you know, was the supreme Allied commander at the time. The Germans had been fighting a very debilitating battle in the east against the Russians, but it was Operation Overlord that Hitler had to worry about. It becomes increasingly clear to Hitler that the war may ultimately be decided in the West. The question of when and where becomes an obsession for the German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Under Rommel's supervision, the Germans rushed to complete the construction of an Atlantic wall, a fortification stretching from Norway all the way to Spain. Rommel insists that millions of mines, jagged triangles of steel, metal-tipped wooden stakes, and millions of tons of concrete are laid. He believes the only way the Allies can be defeated is right at the water's edge.
The Atlantic Wall was the biggest construction project ever. It was just a tremendous. And can you imagine that Dan Hitler was going to seal Europe off from the rest of the world? Can you imagine that?
The heaviest German defenses are where the channel between England and France is the narrowest, at Calais. It will be a major factor of invasion planning to keep the Germans thinking this is where the invasion will occur. The Allied plan to deceive the Germans involves an entire phony division headed up by General George Patton, complete with dummy landing craft, vehicles, and camps. It is created and deployed in the south of England and successfully convinces the Germans that the invasion will be at Calais.
Everything one did was designed to make him reinforce the Pas-de-Calais and to hold him there as long as possible.
In England, meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of soldiers board ships, many unaware of their destination. Just after midnight, June the 6th, American and British paratroopers are dropped behind enemy lines to help secure bridges and roadways so that those who survive the beach landing can move inland. They will be the first, these paratroopers, to engage the enemy. On the morning of June the 6th, 1944, a storm that had raged over much of this beach in Normandy was lifting. Up and down the coast, the Germans who manned the big guns were asleep in their bunkers. At dawn, their wake-up call would be a pounding barrage from Allied naval guns.
It was a glorious sight to see the big belches of orange flame out of those big guns. The barrels seemed like they were red hot, just pumping one shell after another.
It was otherworldly, the way the earth shook and trembled. I curled up as small as I could and stuck my head in the dirt, and I just prayed. Help me, Mary. The time is come.
6:30 a.m. It is now H hour, the hour of landing.
When that ramp went down, one of the good buddies, Lars, started to cry and scream. He says, I can't go in, Claire, I can't. He says, you've got to go, you've got to go. He says, now you've got to go, get on shore as fast as you can and get up that beach.
At Utah Beach, the American force lands quickly and successfully. They had come to shore a mile away from their intended target, but they hit a poorly defended area. In a matter of hours, the German defenses are broken, and the Americans are on their way inland. At Juneau, the Canadian beach, choppy seas delay the assault. Higher tides push landing craft through heavily mined obstacles. There are few casualties, but many landing craft are sunk or damaged. The landings at the British beaches are not without serious resistance, but it collapses when the first wave of soldiers gets on shore and over the beachhead, and within hours, men are over the wall and fighting in the village streets. At Omaha Beach, however, it is almost a disaster. The Americans are pinned down on the beach for hours. The naval guns have not hit the German fortifications above, and German troops have been moved up as reinforcements.
We knew it wasn't going according to plan. We knew that the beaches weren't open, that there was a lot of chaos, and that It was just an overall feeling of chaos and confusion.
The first U.S. company to hit the beach at Omaha loses 96% of its men in the first 2 minutes.
There, on the beach, were bodies of GIs being washed up and back by the waves. The water was full of blood, and they were dead. Then I began to realize that this is serious business.
It would be the longest day, but because the Germans are still convinced that this was not the main invasion, Hitler kept the strongest Panzer tank divisions in reserve. For those of us who are younger, use your imagination again. Imagine those paratroopers coming across here from England in the dark, dropping behind the German lines, in many cases into fields that the Germans had flooded. The 101st Airborne and the 82nd Airborne came to the west. 36 troopers from the 82nd Airborne drowned that night, and the 101st Airborne dropped 6,600 men there, and only 1,000 of them reached their destination originally. There was so much chaos. In a moment, we'll meet some of those men who have come back to Normandy 50 years later because they were determined to jump into France again.
Think of the enormity of transporting hundreds of thousands of soldiers and all their fighting equipment across the English Channel. It was as if in Green Bay, Racine, and Kenosha, Wisconsin, every man, woman, child, and vehicle were picked up and moved from the west side of Lake Michigan to the east side in a single night. This Good Morning America ABC News special will continue in a moment.
The British paratroopers were dropped behind the German lines right around this area in the very early morning hours of June 6th. And yesterday, about 40 of the original parachuters, ranging in age from 68 to 83, chanced fate a second time and recreated their historic jump.
Almost all of us have lost buddies during the war, and it's, I think, a real fitting way to pay tribute to them, to do it again in their memory. All of us, most all of us, are carrying names of guys that we've lost over there, and so that's a part of the whole thing.
Okay, land? Land. Just like so. Good. Do not look at the ground. You will be ground rush. When you hit, it will be beat. Your knees will come into your chest, and you will crunch into the ground.
50 years is a long time. You know, when I went into combat 50 years ago, I never thought about anything like this ever happening. In fact, when we started this a year ago, I never dreamed it would mushroom the way it has here now.
We left part of our youth in France, right here on this spot. We left some of our youth here. We're coming back and trying to make a complete circle and tie it together.
As we left the plane, we were under small arms fire, so we knew that we would probably be opposed immediately on reaching the ground. We dropped from about 350 feet, and I can remember my chute opened, and I swung back and forth probably 2 times, and I hit the ground. When the main group of paratroopers came in, they dropped to the left of me, and many of them dropped into the flooded area, and I could hear their cries of anguish and cries for help. So why do I jump? I think it's in memorial of the fellows that were close to me that I lost during combat.
Now for our annual... Now for our...
Division. I landed right here in this immediate area, and I ran and I went over the wall, and I found myself in a cemetery right here. I went back over the wall, and I found 3 of my men right here from my own squad. We got together, went straight into the square where all the action was going on, and we helped liberate the town here.
Other paratroopers are here too. They've come to commemorate the day 50 years ago when they dropped behind enemy lines in the early morning hours of D-Day. Then they were liberators. Now they're warmly welcomed friends.
Now we are friends. 50 years ago we were enemies.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Joan London, and this is the historic town of Saint-Mère-Église, which figured so prominently in the movie The Longest Day. Some of you may remember that. It was the red button portrayal of one of the paratroopers that really made him the most famous paratrooper. John Steele's parachute got hung up right back there on top of that church steeple. And even today, as you'll see, a figure representing him hangs from the church right here in the town square. Now, we've actually mounted a camera up there so that you can see Steele's perspective. After being shot in the foot as he fell from the sky, he hung there on the steeple for several hours, pretending to be dead so that the German soldiers below on the street would not shoot him. Now, coming up in this half hour, another view of the war, seen through the eyes of a very famous Hollywood director. Our film critic Joel Siegel will take a look at that film for us. It is actually color home movies of the war. Right now, though, about 35 miles from me, Peter Jennings is on Omaha Beach. Good morning, Peter.
Good morning, Joan. This is where you normally put the news of the day on Good Morning America. The news of the day is that the heads of state and government of about 14 countries are here. Of course, President Clinton is here. He's had a very busy day so far. He began this morning with a sunrise ceremony on board the USS George Washington. There in the middle of the English Channel, rather much closer to the French coast, the president paid tribute to those who had died on D-Day.
This new and historically accurate dawn reminds us of that dawn 50 years ago that brought a new era, when thousands of warships assembled to begin Europe's liberation. Allied naval guns unleashed a storm of fire on Normandy's beaches as the sky brightened to a cold gray.
And then the president went on to some of those German gun positions at Point de Hoc, at Hook Point, overlooking Omaha Beach, where the Rangers of the 2nd Battalion had scaled the cliffs on D-Day. The president laid a wreath with the daughter of the Ranger who led the assault on that particular day. This is roughly what the weather was like. And then it was on to a French-U.S. ceremony at Utah Beach, at the westernmost beach, where the American invasion force had had the easiest time, and there with the French President Mitterrand, who was 17 years old in 1944 and had just joined the French army. And once again, American and French troops marched in review, as they have with the Brits, all day long today in a variety of different locations. Much more of it coming up today. As we said, the weather is roughly approximating what it was 50 years ago. Here's Spencer Christian with what it is today.
All right, Peter, I am in Abilene, Kansas at the Eisenhower Center, and I'm in the mall area now, which is right between the Presidential Library and the Museum of the Presidential Library. And as you can see behind me, statue of General Eisenhower, which was dedicated in 1985. You hear the train going by now? I'm told that when General Eisenhower was a young child, he dreamed of being a railroad engineer. But of course, he went on to be much more than that. This statue of the general is 11 feet tall, and it rests on a base that is about 6 feet tall. So in all, 17 feet, a rather imposing and rather impressive statue. Let's take a look at today's weather here in the States. It's going to be a mostly sunny day through the nation's midsection, up and down the plains and out into the southwest. A hot day, in fact, in the southwest, with highs well into the hundreds in some locations. The eastern third of the country will see morning sunshine, but powerful afternoon thunderstorms over a good part of the eastern third of the country. And up in the northwest, a cool, damp, overcast day with periods of rainfall. That's a look at the national weather picture. And now here's a look at the weather where you are.
Temperatures this morning.
Now, a top-secret message that was sent from General Eisenhower at 8 o'clock in the morning of D-Day, June 6th, to General George Marshall. And in this message, he talks about the weather. The students of history know that weather has played an important role in many military operations, and it certainly did on D-Day. And in the paragraph here addressing the issue of weather, General Eisenhower goes on to say that yesterday the weather was bad, yesterday meaning the day before D-Day, but today there's been dramatic improvement, and the operation is underway. And we have the original message right here in our hands. When we continue, Peter Jennings will profile the generals who won and lost D-Day when our Good Morning America ABC News special D-Day Plus 50 continues.
Morning America ABC News special continues. Once again, Peter Jennings.
Our commemoration of D-Day continues, and we have a lot of fascinating people to talk to. I'd like you to just look at one for a moment. The former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Bill Crow, as of the other day, the United States' new ambassador to Great Britain. We'll talk to him in just a minute. He's sitting in Resistance Nest number 62. Admiral, it's great to have you with us this morning.
Thank you, Peter.
We'll get back to you shortly, but before we talk to contemporary admiral or leader like Bill Crow, want to introduce you again to the characters who are so familiar in the battle for D-Day and in the battle for the liberation of Europe. So here is a look at the men who led the men who made such a difference in the Normandy campaign.
Batterien schwerer und leichter Flak bekämpfen Bomber und Luftlandeverbände.
As the battle began in Normandy, the man who had built up Germany's defenses along the coast of France wasn't even in France. Hitler's most famous military commander, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had gone home to celebrate his wife's 50th birthday and would try to see Hitler. His son, Manfred, was then 15 years old. He is now the mayor of Stuttgart.
The 6th of June, 1944, was a great surprise. My father was at home. My father was on the way to see Hitler.
For Rommel, the decision to leave the front had not been easy, but he believed the weather was too bad for an invasion.
The German Navy had told him that landing cannot happen because the sea was too rough. He always trusted the Navy, but now he found out that also the Navy can be wrong.
With the invasion well underway, Rommel began the 500-mile journey back to Normandy. But according to his son, the general no longer believed that Germany could win the war.
My father had the intention to end the war on his own responsibility in France.
But Rommel couldn't convince Hitler to negotiate with the Allies, and so the fighting continued. For General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, June the 6th began as a day of celebration for his family. His son John was graduating from West Point, the general's alma mater.
I found out about that morning when you were getting ready to march off to breakfast. That's how I got the word. The battalion commander turned around and said to me, he said, I hear on the radio the Allies invaded Normandy this morning. I said, Normandy? That's where it was?
Like most young graduates, John Eisenhower's thoughts were fixed on the future. The Army was sending him to England for 3 weeks, where he would become his father's aide.
His personal safety, I think, was probably the least of anything I considered. I guess one is always considered about primarily the success of the operation and what that'll do to the country if it doesn't work. He made no secret about it being a big burden.
Eisenhower's secretary, Captain Mattie Pinette, recalls her boss's state of mind.
The general was so preoccupied with and worried about what was going to happen, he went right past, didn't say hello or anything else.
My business, as you know, is fighting the Germans.
Britain's most famous general, General Bernard Montgomery, would command all of the ground forces once they reached Normandy. He had already fought Rommel in Africa and won.
His confidence was infectious to all of us.
Trevor Martin was a Royal Air Force pilot during the war. He's now 71 years old. He flew this single-engine plane for General Montgomery from 1944 until the war was over.
He didn't just leave me at the aircraft. He took me with him to meet these people. And I was introduced to these generals. You know, it was quite inspiring, really.
Although Montgomery inspired the soldiers who served under him, he proved to be a headache for his superiors. His constant criticism of Eisenhower's military experience and planning led to a strained relationship with the Allied commander.
With all these armies involved and personalities, you're bound to have problems. But as I saw the war, I don't think any two countries could have been better allies and worked together so well.
Honey, we think you're old enough to know the facts. The facts of the last...
This Good Morning America ABC News special continues. Once again, Joan London.
For nearly 40 years, a remarkable film chronicle of World War II's final years sat on a shelf, unknown to anyone. It was discovered in the mid-1980s. It's rarely seen images, and it really shed a whole new light on why the sacrifices made on D-Day were so necessary. And as our film critic Joel Siegel reports, the man who shot all of that film was very well qualified.
George Stevens, one of the great Hollywood directors, Shane, Giant, Gunga Din. Too old for the draft, he enlisted in the Signal Corps at 36, creating black and white newsreels documenting the invasion of Europe. World War II was a black and white war, the issues and the images. But 40 years after the war, his son, producer, writer, found color home movie films Stevens had shot in Europe, and World War II comes alive.
And I went and sat in this little screening room by myself. And up on the screen came this film, this luminous color film, and there was a blue sky and gray barrage balloons above, and a dark blue sea, and it was a ship, and I realized that this was D-Day, and that mine were the first eyes ever seeing this in color, other than the men who were there. To see this in color, in a strange way, it's so more real, and it's timeless. And those shots of the French countryside or the devastated towns of Saint-Lô and Parenton.
The newsreels were edited, American bodies were never shown. But Stevens' footage is uncensored, and in color, you can sense the fear.
And to see these German soldiers, you know, that they were also kind of cardboard figures in black and white, but suddenly they're there with texture and skin and color in their clothing and looking right into the camera from a few feet away, and you say, that's the enemy.
George Stevens' Special Coverage Unit were the first GIs in Paris. Some Germans hadn't received the order to surrender. There was sniper fire. There were flowers. And in color, you can feel the joy.
And then, of course, at the surrender, where von Schultz and General Leclerc go in the train station where the surrender of the city was signed, and then the next shot you see is my father leading them out into the daylight, you know, because he's a film director, and he needs it where he can get a little light on the subject. I mean, certainly the most overpowering, in a human sense, is the concentration camp footage at Dachau, which says, in case there is anyone who ever wants to say that the Holocaust didn't happen, it is the most exact and vivid reminder that it did. I was looking through this film, and I see my father. It was near the Battle of the Bulge, and he's bundled up in the winter, and he's opening a Christmas present in front of his Jeep, and a card falls out, and it says, "To Dad." And here he was, young and full of life, opening it with a big smile. He said he'd had a 50-yard line seat for 3 years watching this war. And he said, you saw people at their very best, and you saw people at their very worst.
We'll be back.
ABC News Special continues.
Supreme Commander Eisenhower made his long-awaited broadcast to the people of France. This was the hour for which oppressed millions had prayed.
People of Western Europe, a landing was made this morning on the coast of France by troops of the Allied Expeditionary Force. I have this message for all of you. Although the initial assault may not have been made in your own country, the hour of your liberation is approaching.
There are monuments and memorials all over this part of Normandy, France, honoring the brave men who fought here 50 years ago. Yesterday, a new statue was unveiled, honoring the Allied Forces Supreme Commander, General Dwight David Eisenhower. And we are fortunate to have with us this morning his granddaughter, Susan Eisenhower. Besides the unveiling, just in general, what does this day mean to you? What are the emotions you're feeling?
Well, it's a very moving experience to be here in Normandy particularly. I mean, we've always sort of marked the day, but to be actually here at the very site where it took place, it's overwhelming.
I don't know if people at home can really grasp the magnitude of the invasion, but certainly your grandfather understood the consequences, understood the chances for failure. Have you gotten a sense of how he faced that task?
Well, actually, that was one of the things that always had a huge impact on the way I looked at him. I know at this time of the year we would sort of mark the date, but it became clear, I only found out actually when I was in high school, that he had carried a note with him at the time of the invasion, taking full responsibility in case of failure. And then I started to think about, being responsible for sending people to their death, in essence. And I think that was one of the hardest things for me to really imagine how he could have felt about that.
Well, this is the time, of course, to remind a whole new generation of that. You have made a point of the fact that the Russians have not been allowed at this, as well as the Germans, and both are quite offended by it.
Well, I think the Russians in particular find it difficult to understand why not. I think it would have been an important thing to do just now, given the importance of the war in their own history and also the political situation in Russia. But I think we shouldn't forget that at least 2 million Germans had lost their lives on the Eastern Front before D-Day was launched, and the Soviets made an enormous contribution in addition to the pivotal Battle of Stalingrad, which took place in 1942.
Yeah, they were really keeping things busy over on the Eastern Front while the sea invasion started over here, and they, of course, were our allies.
Indeed.
And it was a time, maybe this can be a time, though, that we can try to put things behind us. And
I think that's right, but I have been disturbed that the coverage is not focused enough on the overall picture of the war, because, in fact, the Eastern Front played an integral role in the outcome of the war. In fact, many believe that the outcome of the war was already decided before 1944.
Susan Eisenhower, it's nice to have you with us here today on this day to remember, and of course to remember your grandfather.
Thank you.
And our special coverage, Good Morning America, ABC News special coverage, D-Day plus 50 continues. Monarchs of 13 different countries. That will be at the American Cemetery on Omaha Beach, where Peter Jennings is this morning. A little bit later, President Clinton will speak at a special commemoration honoring all the Americans who fell in Normandy. So our special Good Morning America, ABC News coverage, D-Day plus 50 from Normandy, France, will continue. Stay with us.
50 years ago this morning, with a massive array of Navy guns at their back, the Allied forces stormed the beaches at Normandy. The battle for Normandy would go on for 2 months at a terrible cost. More than 200,000 casualties. Above Omaha Beach, the American cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer, 9,386 Americans are buried in the land they liberated.
This is a Good Morning America, ABC News Special.
50 years later, President Clinton and the leaders of other nations whose soldiers fought and died here have come to honor them. So have thousands of survivors. Most only boys then, men in their 70s and 80s now, here to view once again the place where they fought.
It's supposed to be 16, number 46.
Some to search for a fallen comrade.
D-Day, June 6th, 1944. Once again, Joan London.
And good morning, I'm Joan London. Welcome to our Good Morning America ABC News special coverage commemorating D-Day 1944, that historic day in World War II when the Allied forces carried out the biggest invasion in military history. It really spelled the beginning of the end for Nazi oppression in Germany. I, this morning, am in this historic French town, Saint-Mère-Église. Behind me, some singers that have come from Wisconsin back home to sing. About 35 miles from here, Peter Jennings is at Omaha Beach, the site of D-Day's bloodiest battle. Peter?
Good morning, Joan, and thank you, and good morning again, everybody. Just to remind you, there were 50 miles of Normandy Beach across which the Allied forces came 50 years ago, and Omaha Beach behind me, where the tide is almost all out. We're quite near a medical unit here, which from time to time the helicopter takes off. No helicopters 50 years ago, but it does give you a good shot of what the beach is like. It's been a very busy day of commemoration here in this particular part of Normandy, 2.5 hours away from Paris. The Queen has been here, the President of France has been here, and of course President Clinton has been here. He began his day at Pont de Hoc. At Pont de Hoc overlooking Omaha Beach, where the Rangers had scaled so high, the President spoke.
Your lives. Here are the generations for whom you won a war. We are the children of your sacrifice. We are the sons and daughters you saved from tyranny's reach.
President Clinton at one of many occasions today in which he has spoken for the generation which has a hard time remembering because so few Americans alive today experienced it. But here are a couple of them up here down over Omaha Beach where they are. They both came into Omaha Beach at the time of the invasion. Nice to see you, gentlemen. Welcome back to Normandy under much better circumstances. They happen to be standing on top of a German bunker. It's called Resistance Nest number 62. And yesterday we found it to be a particularly meaningful place to be because here we encountered an American who had landed on this beach and a German who was defending his position. It made for quite an occasion. Yesterday morning, with the wind and the rain reminding them of D-Day 50 years ago, we spent a little time talking to two men who were enemies then and have become friends since. On this gentle hill over Omaha Beach, there was no greenery then. It was all sand and scrub and German fortifications. Fred Ireland was an American captain trying to get ashore and stay alive. Franz Gockel, on my right, was a young German rifleman trying to defend his position.
When it became light, we could see that the entire horizon was full of ships, big ones and small ones. We had never expected to see such numbers. It was a total surprise, a shock for us to see so many.
For Franz Gockel, then 18 years old, it was his first experience in combat. He'd never even seen the sea before. Together, a junior doctor with a surgical unit attached to the 1st Infantry. This wasn't his first campaign.
Everybody piled out as quickly as they could because the Germans would shoot naturally at the runway of the boat, knowing the men would have to come out.
They drove those boats practically through the sand, and then men began to jump out. And those first ones all fell. I don't know if they died or were wounded, but many of them just didn't get up.
There was one man, soldier, sitting on a bulldozer, trying to clear the defenses, and we... You know what's happening. We realized he would die, but he kept, and he knew he was going to die, and he kept on.
As the first tank made it across to the gap in the defense line, one of my comrades with an anti-tank cannon was able to stop him. But more and more tanks and support vehicles were going back and forth along the beach, trying to find a way through.
But find a way through they did.
Siegfried, our gunner, was 15 yards away from me. He was alone now because his other buddy had been wounded, and I knew Siegfried had to continue shooting, so I called out, "Siegfried, keep it up, we will make it." But we couldn't do much damage anymore.
By now, the tanks on the beach were firing back at Resistance Nest 62, hitting both the anti-tank guns and several of the men. The Americans were gaining ground.
I continued shooting with my rifle until noon. Until this time, we held our position. But by now, a lot of our comrades were dead. And on the right, about 300 meters away, the Americans were moving up. And to the left, they had also broken through.
Gockel pulled back and was eventually captured.
And then the 1st Division fellows came up and took this blockhouse here. And after they took the blockhouse, they tried to go inland. And we came in here to the blockhouse, and wounded were coming in. We started working on them. The men that had a little scratch or something were just bandaged up and so on. But the cases that were turned over to the surgical groups were the men who wouldn't survive ordinarily, so that they were seriously wounded. At the end of the battle for the beach, how many were alive?
Yeah, from our group, 5 or 6, and from the artillery, 2 men.
What I find interesting is that you and Mr. Gockel have clearly forgiven one another.
Well, I don't have anything to forgive him. I mean, he did what he had to do, and I did what I had to do, and it was not something we have to blame somebody for. It is easy to love your friends, but what you must do is love your enemies.
A lot of talk about the much vaunted German defenses here over Omaha Beach. If you take another look at this bunker up here, Herr Gockel told us yesterday that he wasn't finished until 4 weeks before the invasion, and in those days, gentlemen, it didn't have a roof on it. So it's a somewhat changed bunker that you're standing on this morning. 2 men with memories, many people with memories. We'll be back in just a moment. Joan?
You know, Peter, most of the people in this area have come over to where you are now for the big ceremony this morning here in Saint-Mère-Église. Most of the ceremonies were last night. There's still a little bit of singing going on, though, here for those who are left. We're going to go now, though, to Spencer Christian, who is spending the morning in Abilene, Kansas. He's at the Eisenhower Center. Actually, right now, he's outside the childhood home of the man who would one day command the Allied forces here in Normandy. Spencer?
That is correct, Joan, and not only was this the Eisenhower home, it still rests on its original site. This is now a 22-acre complex with 5 buildings. This is one of them. And we have a picture to show you, a family photo taken in 1926 of the entire Eisenhower family assembled right here on this very porch. This served as the Eisenhower home from 1898, when Ike was a mere 8 years old, to 1946, when Ike's mother died. 1 year later, in 1947, the year of my birth, in fact, this home was open to the public. So we're going to go in and take a look around right now. As you enter the front door of the home, the very first room to the left was the formal parlor. This was the room in which the family did its entertaining. The Eisenhower boys were not allowed in this room except on Sunday. Now, as you leave the formal parlor, the front parlor, and go back into the hallway, just a few steps down, the next door on the left was the back parlor, as it was called, but it really served as the everyday family room for the Eisenhowers. And in this room, there are many of the original items, but the first thing you notice is this piano here on the left, which was actually used to give piano instruction to the 7 Eisenhower sons. And that big radio there in the corner was one of 2 radios here in the house, which Mrs. Eisenhower, Ike's mother, listened to reports from World War II. We have a report on today's weather right now. Let's go to the map, take a look at what's happening around the country, and more from the Eisenhower Center in Abilene, Kansas in the next half hour. Joan?
All right, Spencer. For many of the veterans who've come to Normandy this week, the 50th anniversary commemoration of D-Day is really a family affair, and for a lot of them it might be a final chance to kind of pass on to their loved ones their pivotal place in history. George Means, he's from Clemson, South Carolina. He served with the Coast Guard in Normandy. He was a motor machinist mate first class, and he has returned this week with 2 generations, and we were able to catch up with them shortly after their arrival.
I couldn't tell them all this, and I thought the best way is for them to see for themselves.
What George Means wants his son and grandson to see is a generation that went to war and was left with emotions that no history book could ever explain.
The people had a long way to go, and see these holes in here? They were deeper then because the bombs going off and everything.
George spent a few private moments on Utah Beach with his grandson David, giving a first-hand account of what happened just after dawn on these beaches 50 years ago.
The Point to Hook is right down there, which was the dividing line between the two beaches. And of course they had gunfire coming this way across the water, and they were also covering Omaha.
Serving in the Coast Guard, George Means had a pretty good view of that morning. The Guard helped transport men and equipment onto the beaches while under heavy fire from German artillery. 3,000 Allied soldiers died on the beaches that day, many without ever firing a single shot, a sacrifice that France has never forgotten. One of the most moving moments for the Means family and other returning vets occurred when they visited the small French village of Carnacy.
I will, on his behalf, have the great honor and the privilege to decorate you.
The mayor honored them on behalf of the town for their bravery in the Normandy campaign.
Mr. Means, I congratulate you very much. I know that your compatriots will be very proud of you, and I'll share their pride.
May I say one thing, please, to the people? Tell them I'm very proud to be here and to be with them who were part of the resistance, who made it possible.
It's not just a commemoration for the town, but for the vets as well. A rare chance to swap stories and renew old relationships.
In time of war, it's amazing what people do for other people who you never knew before at all, who you probably would never have met before in your lifetime.
It was also a chance for George's family to get to know him better. D-Day was George and Hilma's first wedding anniversary, but even after 50 years, she's still learning about the experience which helped shape both of their lives.
This is bringing out feelings and thoughts and emotions I know that he just hasn't expressed before. And sometimes I get choked up when he gets choked up.
How much of this did you know about in advance versus what you learned about after the fact? Did they tell you very much about what you were doing?
They never told me anything.
Even though George's son Kenneth visited Normandy when he was a teenager and served in the armed forces during the Vietnam era, there was still a lot he didn't understand about the legacy of D-Day.
And I understand more about why the war was fought and how it was fought, and actually the repercussions of it 50 years later.
D-Day proved to be a turning point for the war in Europe, but the price was high.
I've heard numbers before of the people that died, but you don't really realize it until you actually see all the white crosses.
You shared something, and you want to share it again, but you want to come back and pay respects to those who couldn't share it, and that's the whole purpose of all this.
And George Means and about 150 other veterans traveled here to Normandy with the help of a nonprofit foundation called the Battle of Normandy Foundation. We'll be back.
This Good Morning America ABC News special will continue in a moment. This Good Morning America ABC News special continues. Once again, Peter Jennings.
You can see that the tide has gone farther out on Omaha Beach. The Germans had expected that the Allies would land at high tide. And 50 years ago, a lot of their mines were covered by the water. The American commander, General Eisenhower, decided to land at low tide. Look at all that beach that running men had to come across carrying 60-pound packs. A lot of people to talk to in the course of the day. We're now joined by two of the most distinguished, and I don't use that word lightly. One of them is Colonel, Trevor Dupuy, retired, one of America's great military historians, is the author of 90 books. including several with his father. Colonel Dupuy, thank you for joining us today. Nice to see you again.
It's a pleasure to be here, Peter.
If you wouldn't mind, we don't have an awful lot of time at the beginning. Would you mind telling the story of your father on D-Day?
Well, yes. The story is that my father was the head of public relations for SHAEF headquarters, and he tried to get the American and British radio people to agree as to which one should make the first announcement as to D-Day. And they absolutely could not agree. The Americans insisted they should be the ones. The British insisted they should be the ones. And after he couldn't get them to agree, he said,
Although the initial assault may not have been made in your own country, the hour of your liberation is approaching. All patriots, men and women, young and old, have a part to play in the achievement of final victory.
6 juin 1944, le général de Gaulle.
And this is the voice of General de Gaulle, Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French, who broadcast to the French people on the day of the invasion.
The ultimate assault has begun. After so much fighting, fury and misery, the decisive blow has been launched, the blow we have hoped for. It is, of course, the Battle of France, and it is also the Battle of the French. Massive offensive resources have commenced for our relief to roll in from the shores of ancient England. In a not distant past, the tidal wave of German oppression was thwarted by the last stronghold of Western Europe. It is today the launching base of the offensive for liberty. France, subdued for 4 years, but in no way subjugated nor vanquished. France has risen up to be part of it. For the sons of France, wherever they are, whoever they are, there is a simple and sacred duty to fight with all the means at their disposal.
Here you see this symbolic recreation of the landing at Omaha Beach 50 years ago, with the members of all the nations, the flag of Norway there, which is familiar to us now from the recent Olympics. Norway occupied by the Germans, of course, during World War II. It was in Norway, by the way, that the Allies had partly convinced the Germans the Allied invasion would come. 2 phantom armies set up in Britain to convince the Germans that the invasion might come through Norway. The tide is at its farthest point right about now, and as these men come ashore in this recreation, you can again get the sense of what it must have been like to cross these sands under such utterly different circumstances. Marines in those white hats in the foreground. Seeing these ships reminds us of the ones you may have seen on the news over the last several months who tried to leave California, members of the Coast Guard who had tried to leave California and come back and participate in these ceremonies, and they broke down off the Yucatan Peninsula. So they're probably watching this on television. We salute them as well. That looks a little bit like it may be a leftover piece from one of the portable harbors called the Mulberries, which were dragged over here by the Allies and set up on these beaches so that hundreds of tons of men and equipment could be landed in the days after the invasion.
My fellow veterans, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. What a peaceful, pleasant place this is today. How different it is from 50 years ago when I and many of you and many thousand of our comrades approached this shore. What was it like on D-Day is the question most asked of veterans who were here then. We will surely all agree that it was the longest day of our lives. We prepared for D-Day in England. I was not new to battle, having survived the North Africa and Sicily invasions, where my brother and I had fought side by side. Still, I remember my amazement when we came into Southampton area prior to our embarkation. Rows and rows of tanks, artillery guns, trucks, jeeps, armored personnel vehicles, and warehouses of logistical supplies lined England's lush fields. The harbors were so filled with boats that we could have walked their length, stepping from craft to craft. I suddenly appreciated the United States support of the war effort. We were the men on the front line, but the hard work of our mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers still at home made this tremendous military operation feasible. We came on our feet, but we brought their hearts and prayers with us. A final battalion briefing readied us for the invasion. My brother and I had been assigned to different companies, and as the briefing ended, we waved to each other. We would make the landing on separate ships. What was it like on D-Day? 2 days later, when the ship I was on pulled out, we certainly were not alone. There were ships in front of us and to each side of us for as far as we could see. By the time we were partway across, the ships behind us seemed not to end. We looked skyward, where planes from horizon to horizon headed toward Europe. When we got near the beaches, battleships and cruisers were firing towards shore. We could hear bombs exploding in the distance. There was such firepower from the ships and planes that we didn't expect much resistance on the beach. I believe a lot of us wondered how anyone on shore could survive the onslaught of the massive firepower. What was it like on D-Day? My platoon boarded an assault craft to approach the beach. Luckily for us, the Germans were concentrating their firepower on the larger landing crafts. When we hit a sandbar, the ramp went down, and as soon as we left the boat, we were in water up to our armpits. For some shorter personnel, it was deeper. We waited and scrambled towards shore. What was it like on D-Day? We found men pinned down on the beach, many wounded or killed, and many terrified, all surrounded by ruined and swamped landing craft. The dead and wounded soldiers, the wreckage, the ability of the enemy to cause so much damage made us realize that this war was far from over, with its noise of mines, detonating bombs, Airplanes' continuous roar, mortar and artillery shells bursting on the beach, rifle and machine gun fire ripping holes in the sand and splashing in the water. This war was far from over. However, D-Day turned the tide. Sadly, it was the end of the war for a great many brave men who died here that day. But it was also the beginning of the end of the war for Hitler. The world changed on June the 6th, 1944, the day the good guys took charge again. It did not mean peace, but it marked the stand for freedom that would continue through the Korean War, the Vietnam conflict, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the Allied containment of Iraq. The spirit of D-Day carried Allied momentum across the hedgerows of France, through the Ardennes and the Battle of the Bulge, and toward Berlin. It put new hope into the battle-weary troops in the Pacific. While we braved these then fortified beaches to beat back Hitler and to liberate Europe, to stop his massacre and to rescue his prisoners, we fought for much more than that. We fought to preserve what our forefathers had died for. We picked up our guns to protect our faith, to preserve our liberty. Our purpose went well beyond aiding our allies as they faced the German Blitz. It was to save our way of life for our parents and siblings at home, for our children and the children we hope to have, and for their children. It has been a way of life that was worth fighting for. We have enjoyed the longest period of world peace in modern history. We relish new spectrums of religious, racial, and political tolerance. We are free of the tyrannies of the lack of Hitler. We must not forget, however, what this freedom cost. We earned the security with our sweat and our blood, and some of us with our lives. Much of it was earned right here in Normandy. Many of those who enjoy freedom now know little of its price. This anniversary must not be only in a remembrance, but a new beginning. Many of us still live with D-Day, but never talk about it. We need to talk about it, not for ourselves, but for those who weren't here, not necessarily to the media, but to the heirs of our accomplishments, those we did it for. Our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren must know the price of freedom. I pray that the price we paid on this beach will never be mortgaged, that my grandsons and granddaughters will never face the terror and horror that we faced here. But they must know that without freedom, there is no life, and that the things most worth fighting for may sometimes demand dying for. Today, 50 years later, the beaches are quiet. We come back to mourn our losses and to celebrate our success. Our presence here commemorates ours and our comrades' lives, and it validates the sacrifices we all made on D-Day. What was D-Day like? That wave in Southampton, England, was the last time I saw my brother. He died here on Omaha Beach. That we can be here today proves that it was not in vain. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Staff Sergeant Walter Ehlers, that's the Congressional Medal of Honor he's wearing around his neck. His brother died in the first few minutes of D-Day on Omaha Beach, about 300 yards from where his brother landed. This is Colonel Alvin Ungerleider from the 29th Infantry Division.
Et j'y ai vécu toute ma vie. En 1944,
I beg your pardon, this is the French interpretation.
Pourtant, je n'ai rien vu du début du débarquement. J'ai seulement
From the 4th to the 5th of June, many
As the
planes
French
have flown
interpretation
by.
continues, we will be back in just a moment.
Puis cela a recommencé dans la
The official tribute to the dead of the Normandy invasion. Flags of the 14 nations which participated in the invasion of Normandy, and one of the many obelisks dotting the countryside here, paying tribute either to units or to regiments or divisions. Slight confusion here today only, as the tributes are interrupted occasionally by aircraft.
À gauche. Gauche. En avant. Marche.
Dans quelques instants, on va commencer le défilé des
The French organization, and in some cases the disorganization of these D-Day celebrations, has been most intense. The crowd here has just been asked to stand and participate in a moment of silence, and now
The first one will be the United States of America Special Unit, representing all the battle forces involved in June 6, 1944 landing, 1st United States Army, 1st Infantry Division,
flag of Malta back there.
Division, Rangers, 4th Infantry, 9th Infantry,
Knights of Malta Cross. This appears to be a parade of the colors of the nations and the units which have participated somehow in the liberation of France, led, of course, first by the United States. Hitler's great miscalculation, it is often said, to declare war on America at the time the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, bringing America into the European War. A vast army raised in a short period of time, without which the liberation of Europe would not have occurred. This will continue. We shall rejoin it in just a moment. Welcome back to our coverage of the D-Day anniversary. There's been so much concentration on this particular anniversary. These are a group of French gendarmes out in the Norman countryside, standing on top of what was a German bunker overlooking Omaha Beach. They have been as interested as anybody in what's been going on throughout Normandy in these last several days. Out in the English Channel, where it's 100 miles from here to England, some of the ships representing the nations that participated in the invasion. And this stunning beach, such a beautiful beach on a sunny day. The other day we saw a young French child and a young German child playing in the water, reminding us all that history moves on. And all along here in what is remaining of the Atlantic Wall, Hitler may have convinced himself that it was something that would hold the Allies back, but his senior generals, not least of whom Erwin Rommel, his tactical commander in the West and his overall commander in the West, believed it was a farce. Try as they would, they did not think that they could stop the Allies at the beaches. And there was no great depth to it either. Once the Allies had breached and got up over these cliffs, as the Rangers did at Pointe du Hoc, and knocked out the big German guns, which were much farther back from the edge than they'd anticipated, there was simply no standing, no stopping the Allies getting on shore. But it was a long and vicious battle here in Normandy, and the breakout didn't occur for almost 2 months. One British objective for the first day, the city of Caen, about an hour's drive from here today, took them 3 weeks to capture. We're joined here this morning as the international ceremony goes on by two of our favorite historians in the United States. One young Alan Brinkley, son of David Brinkley, as I think anybody knows, who's come, not born at the time of the D-Day invasion, though his father was a journalist in Washington. And the other joining us in New York, retired now from Columbia University, the distinguished Professor Henry Graff. I would like it this morning if you would both give us something of the broader perspective of the war in America. But Henry, I'd like to start with you, as I may, because while Alan was too young to participate, you were absolutely crucial to the war effort. Tell us about it.
Well, Peter, I don't know how crucial I was, but I did supply a little footnote to the D-Day invasion. I was a sergeant engaged in cryptanalysis, which was the reading of codes, and as a translator of the Japanese language, I had the honor and the opportunity to pick up one of the most incredible messages in the history of nation-states. The United States had broken the Japanese diplomatic code. Located in Berlin was Lieutenant General Oshima Hiroshi, who was a very devout Nazi, who spoke excellent German, a very close friend of Hitler, and of Joachim von Ribbentrop, who was the Nazi foreign minister. And Ribbentrop gave Oshima and his staff a tour of the North France defenses in November of 1943. And I was on duty alone when Oshima's report came in. The Germans had no idea that the United States was reading the Japanese code. The Germans had tried to read that Japanese code and had failed. And Oshima sent home an account of what he had seen that General Marshall later said saved a division of lives. It gave the entire German order of battle and much other information as to the German plans for the repelling of the invasion. And through Oshima, we learned more than an army of spies on the ground could have provided. And it is very interesting that as Oshima continued to report and to have conversations with Hitler, we confirmed that Hitler was expecting the invasion in Normandy to be merely a feint, and that the real bust-through was going to come at Pas de Calais.
Really what you were doing there, Henry Graff, was confirming what the British, of course, had discovered earlier when they had broken the Enigma code. They had managed to discover the process by which the Germans codified their messages. The Poles had originally worked on it very diligently and come close, and then the French. But finally the British broke the Enigma code. And that thing about the Japanese embassy in Berlin, as we watched this international ceremony continue, was that it was incredibly talkative, Henry Graff. Germany and Japan were allies, of course, but they just talked their heads off all the time.
Oshima spoke excellent German, and that drew him very close to the Nazi leaders because there were very few Japanese they could speak with.
Let me bring in Alan Brinkley now, because as we watch members of a particular French regiment march past, Alan, it's the road to D-Day which has struck so many people as being crucial. We heard Susan Eisenhower say earlier there wasn't enough emphasis on the Eastern Front. And of course, Stalin had been pushing the United States and Britain to do this even sooner, hadn't he?
Well, from the very first days of American entry into the war, Peter, Stalin was pushing very hard for the Allies, the Western Allies, to open a second front to relieve pressure on him in the East. And as someone said earlier in the broadcast, Roosevelt and General Marshall wanted to open a front in 1942. The British were very wary of that and persuaded Roosevelt, Churchill persuaded Roosevelt instead to join with the British in the invasion of North Africa as a way of getting troops into battle quickly, because Churchill believed, it seems correctly, that it wouldn't have been possible to mount an expedition of this magnitude that quickly. But then the North African invasion led to the Italian invasion, and as General Marshall had feared, this contributed to putting off the Normandy invasion not only in 1943, but of course into 1944. So the Americans, I think there was a sort of balance between perhaps an excessive caution on the British side about this invasion and an excessive optimism on the American side about the prospects for success in an earlier date.
Well, as Alan Brinkley and others have pointed out, it was Churchill's memories perhaps of World War I that the terrible loss of life for the Commonwealth soldiers particularly, that led him to be cautious about this invasion.
That's right, particularly since Churchill was critically involved in the disastrous Gallipoli invasion of World War I, and it made him very concerned about softening up the enemy sufficiently before sending in the major amphibious landing here.
This international march past continues.
Good Morning America ABC News Special continues. Once again, Peter Jennings.
The international ceremony at Omaha Beach, as regimental representatives from all of the countries involved march past in the presence of the political and, in some cases, national, non-political, i.e. kings and queens, leadership of the countries that participated in the invasion 50 years ago. On the beach below us here, literally right below our bunker, the vestiges of more contemporary warfare, Black Hawk helicopters landing for reasons we do not know. Just beside us here, familiar to Americans, of course, from the Gulf War. Down on that beach is ABC's Jim Wooten. I'm not sure we'll be able to hear him over the helicopters, but Jim, as you're down there, keep thinking about this beach at Omaha, and then farther to your left, the British beaches, and how different it was for the invading forces 50 years ago.
You're absolutely right, Peter. And one reason was because the British approached their objectives in a much different way than the Americans did at Omaha. I recall just a moment ago you were talking about Utah, which is much further west on the beach, and the good fortune and the accident that drifted most of the landing craft there of the 4th Division to the east, and therefore into a weak point in the German defenses. Down to the east, the British Juno Sword and Gold and the Canadians decided not to go head-on into German defenses, such as the bunker where you're located today, but rather to go in between the strongholds and then to fan. That was a very effective lesson that they had learned from the raid at the Dieppe the year before. The Americans, applying a theory of assault that still exists, frankly, in American infantry tactics, went head-on in this area, which was one of the German strong points on that day. It could have been, as Omar Bradley said, an irreversible catastrophe. It was only reversed because of individual heroism and valor, and the fact that that late in the afternoon, as a matter of fact, the armor began to arrive and began to make some difference here. So basically, as you look along this beach now, you can see what an enormous task it was for men, particularly in the first wave, to come across this. The tide is now at its lowest, which is about what it was on that morning, to come across without cover all the way up to here, up to the base of that hill where you're sitting, which was all sand at that point, all bare, all naked, all exposed to fire from all the way across from down there, it was a rather gruesome experience. The only cover available later on for the second wave and the third and the fourth were the bodies and the wreckage of those who had come before.
Well, we've all been struck by the history we have read. Some of us have read the same history, some of us different. I think the thing that gives me a very dramatic sense of the carnage on the beach that day, we were talking to Admiral Crowe about it earlier, is that as the tide came in, you're quite right, it's almost out completely now, so the beach is very wide, but as it came in, and Americans were trying to hide behind various German installations, metal installations that had been revealed by the low tide, they found themselves being simply pushed in closer to the Germans' gun by an incoming tide. I don't quite know why these Black Hawk helicopters have landed below us, but let's go now back to the International Ceremony, where again it's the French. That's Queen Elizabeth, Duke of Edinburgh up there, Queen Beatrice of the Netherlands beside her, the other members of the various nations, President Clinton just to the right with Mrs. Clinton, and President Mitterrand, François Mitterrand, now 77 years old, who is going to speak here. In fact, as far as I know, he's going to be the only person to speak. Various people reach for their earphones for simultaneous translation. A little later at the American Cemetery here, which is clearly one of the most moving places in all of Normandy, among the many cemeteries of every Allied nation there is overseas. President Clinton is going to speak. For those of you around the country just joining us, this is a special edition of Good Morning America and ABC News. We're commemorating the 50th anniversary of D-Day. Joan London is here with us, as always, at this time of the morning, and we are pleased to be able to join her. These are the leaders of the nations which participated in the Allied invasion of Europe 50 years ago. President Mitterrand, behind him Queen Elizabeth, just beyond Václav Havel, the President of the Czech Republic, President Clinton, Queen Beatrice, right in the center there, slightly portly gentleman, Lech Wałęsa, who's now the President of Poland. The King of the Belgians is here, the Australian Prime Minister, the Canadian Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, and the Governor General of Canada. And this is a French choir extolling the valor and dedication of those who began the liberation of Europe.
Sur
is for all of us who are free today because of the commitment and dedication of 50 years ago. President Clinton has been here today thanking the men of yesterday, many of whom are here today, more than 9,000 of whom are buried in this cemetery, Americans, and elsewhere on this piece of French territory are buried British and Canadians and Germans. This has also been a time of reconciliation with many German veterans of the Normandy campaign coming here and paying tribute to the American dead. And yesterday morning at a very moving ceremony in the German cemetery, American vets going to pay tribute to the Germans who fell here. 292,000 Americans died during World War II. 671,000 members of the military were wounded. 271,000 British troops died. 39,000 Canadians. 13,600,000 Russians. 205,000 French. 320,000 Poland. 305,000 Yugoslavs, 3,300,000 Germans. Who died this morning, or all those who died 50 years ago. President Clinton said this morning, "We are the children of your sacrifice," the French President, François Mitterrand. Again, in case you've just joined us, he was a member of the French resistance, wounded at the beginning of World War II, 77 now. Captured by the Germans, was a prisoner of war, escaped and joined the resistance.
Majesté,
Your Majesty,
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
Mesdames et Messieurs,
ladies and gentlemen,
aucun de ceux qui l'ont éprouvé
none of which who lived through this event will ever forget
et de gravité
the gravity of this event.
qu'ils ont connu par ce matin gris et pluvieux.
The event which they lived through on that morning in 1944.
Ils ont appris la nouvelle simple et bouleversante.
When they learned the simple news,
Les Alliés ont débarqué en Normandie.
the Allies have arrived in Normandy.
De cette annonce, chacun devinait l'imminence.
From this news, all could guess the importance.
Ceux qui l'espéraient et ceux qui la craignaient. Tous les regards, toutes les attentes se sont
All eyes
portés vers ces plages.
were driven to these beaches,
où l'on ne distingue plus aujourd'hui que les mouvements du ciel et de la mer.
where the only thing left is the movement of the sea and the sky today.
Où nous commémorons, après un demi-siècle,
We commemorate after 50 years the courage and sacrifice,
de l'opération Overlord.
the sacrifice of the men and women of Operation Overlord.
L'acte majeur à partir duquel a basculé le sort de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale.
This was the act.
L'opération, on le sait, avait failli être remise.
This operation, we know, was almost delayed for weather reasons. The situation in early June was disastrous.
Lorsqu'à l'aube du 5, le général Eisenhower,
On the morning of the 5th, General Eisenhower
let's go, allons-y,
said,
en ajoutant, je n'aime pas ça, mais je ne vois pas comment
let's go.
nous pourrions faire autrement.
Although I don't like it, I know I can do no different.
Le lendemain matin, à 5h30,
The next morning at
les premiers
5:30,
groupes d'attaque atteignaient le rivage,
the first attack groups landed on the beach.
sautés par milliers,
Paratroopers jumped by the thousands.
partout, mais plus spécialement ici même, dans l'enfer d'Omaha Beach.
They landed everywhere, but especially here in the hell of Omaha Beach.
Bradley, commandant la première armée américaine, l'a plus tard relaté dans ces termes, que je cite, « Des messages reçus, nous ne pouvions tirer qu'un incohérent assemblage de naufrages.
From the news we were receiving from the beaches,
Ennemi très dur.
we could only understand the harshness of the enemy fire.
La bataille appartenait ce matin à la mince ligne en kaki détrempée qui se traînait sur la côte française. Et oui, c'est sur cette mince ligne en kaki qu'a reposé le destin du monde.
It was on this thin line of beach on which the future of the world rested.
Mais tout se jouait sur cette étroite bande du littoral normand.
Everything was played on here, these beaches of Normandy.
De l'ordre. Et le soir, au prix d'énormes pertes,
That evening, after thousands and thousands of deaths,
les Alliés occupaient les 5 plages.
the Allies had landed and were occupying the 5 beaches.
Caen, Bayeux, Cabourg. Mais ils tenaient.
The Allies were holding strong in Caen, in Bayeux, and in Cabourg.
Les fameuses entre toutes, suivies de combats qui ne s'achevèrent en Normandie qu'à la fin du mois de juillet, faisant encore 30 000 morts.
The combats and the fights would only end in Normandy at the end of July after 30,000 more dead.
Que l'on peut sans forcer les mots, parmi les seuils de l'histoire, a été si souvent raconté. Il s'est inscrit dans nos esprits par tant de souvenirs,
It is written in our mind,
tant de livres,
in so many books,
tant d'images,
in so many words, in so many pictures,
profondément notre jeunesse,
that this has marked our youth so profoundly.
même sans qu'elle sache pourquoi, la façon d'être des générations à venir.
It has also marked the way of thinking of future generations.
Ici, à l'endroit exact où nous nous trouvons, une certaine manière de vivre.
It is here, on this exact spot where we now stand, that a certain way of life was born.
Sur le véritable ennemi, le nazisme, ce qui
Here we stood united against the true enemy, Nazism.
qui bafoue et qui traque le droit des gens, les droits de l'homme, les libertés, et qui
The rights of man, the rights of freedom.
en bâillonne ou en tue les ultimes défenseurs. Ce combat n'a pas cessé avec la victoire de 1945.
This fight against tyranny did not stop with the victory of 1945.
Détruisant, meurtrissant, laissant derrière elle d'immenses champs de ruines. Et d'autres régimes du même type ont continué et continuent de s'édifier sur la peine et sur la douleur, sur l'anéantissement de ce que l'enfance imagine immortel, la beauté, l'amitié, l'amour de la vie et le respect des autres. Des camps de concentration, des tortures, des censures de toutes sortes, ces lentes morts pires que la mort ont continué et continuent, ici ou là, de servir d'instruments à des pouvoirs sans âme qui ne connaissent qu'un ordre idée de toute autre substance, ordre sans justice, ordre sans pitié.
As President Mitterrand is talking about the tyranny against which everybody fought in 1945, Admiral Krau and I have been listening, and you've been saying, Admiral Krau, Hitler was the embodiment, but he made so many mistakes.
Well, he made strategic and tactical mistakes, just in a host of them, time and time again. But of course, for a man with global ambitions, he didn't build the kind of force he needed to extend that, and he suffered tremendously at sea. He didn't have a sufficient air force, and he put his emphasis on the ground. But in the ground, he absolutely refused to give up territory. Once they conquered territory, it was an article of faith with him that it should not be surrendered under any circumstances. That defeated him in Russia more than any other area, and it defeated him here at D-Day as well.
The invasion here at the time of D-Day, there was virtually no German opposition out there in the Channel, was there, either by air or by sea?
D-Day was fought with complete air superiority. The curious thing about it is a huge argument raised, of course, among the German command as to how to defend against an invasion. And the only German general that had ever fought under Allied air superiority was Rommel in northern Africa after 2 years there. And at El Alamein, he had absolutely no air cover whatsoever, and he had seen what complete Allied air superiority could do to a maneuvering force where it was clear that they could bomb. And he was the one that insisted they had to hold them to the beaches.
I'm very struck when we look at this, of course. This is, sorry, step on your mic here, but this part of the Great Atlantic Wall that Hitler said he believed in, but not many other people believed in, and he never came to see it after he ordered it to be built.
Of course, the interesting thing is that Rommel is the man that's credited with doing it, but even Rommel had no confidence in their ability to defend. After El Alamein, Rommel agitated very hard to sue for peace. In fact, Hitler threw him out of his presence on numbers of occasions because Rommel brought it up.
Hitler inspired such fear in his own people at the time of the Normandy invasion here. People were afraid to wake him up and tell him that the Allies had actually landed. And as a result, some of the German tanks he could have brought to bear were held in reserve.
But even then, the problem of defending against the Allies is that no matter what theory you adopted, either Rommel's or somebody else's, they didn't have the resources to defend in depth. They didn't have sea resources, they didn't have air resources, they didn't have panzer resources. And the only way you could stop the Allied invasion was to have both. You have static defenses and maneuvering offenses, as well as something at sea and in the air, and they didn't have that. There was no suitable strategy to stop the Allies.
But once it started here, it was just a matter of time.
Essentially.
It's wonderful to listen to you. Admiral William Krau, now America's ambassador to Great Britain, just across the channel there. We'll be back to the international ceremony in just a moment. Point de Hoc on the Normandy coast. A sheer cliff rising 100 feet from the beach. At the top, 6 heavy German guns, which U.S. Rangers had to eliminate. 50 years ago this morning, 225 U.S. Rangers went straight up those cliffs. More than half of them died. They got the guns. One of the first great Allied victories of D-Day.
This is a Good Morning America, ABC News Special.
50 years ago this morning, more than 10,000 Allied bombers have softened up the German defenders. 13,000 paratroopers have dropped behind their lines. Now the frontal assault is underway. 150,000 soldiers storming the beaches of Normandy in what still ranks as the greatest invasion in history. The Allies land in Europe.
Once again, from St. Mary, John London.
And good morning, everyone. If you are just joining us, this has been a day filled with emotion for the thousands of World War II veterans who have come here to commemorate D-Day. They are here to remember their fallen comrades and also to celebrate their role in the liberation of France. This is D-Day plus 50, a Good Morning America ABC News special. I'm here in the small French town of Saint-Mère-Église, the first French town to be liberated by the American forces. The international ceremonies have been going on at the American Cemetery in Colville. Just down the hill from there at Omaha Beach is Peter Jennings. Peter?
Thank you, and good morning again, Joe. It's about 20 minutes after 4 in the afternoon here, and there's a genuine fascination, I think, among all concerned as we see the international ceremonies continue. President Mitterrand has just spoken of the history of the war, and the great compliments have again been forthcoming to those people who liberated his country. Up here, overlooking bunker number 62, what the Germans called Resistance 62, again, a large group of curious onlookers, including many members of the French gendarmerie, who've been responsible for keeping everybody else out of everybody's way. And while we have been working up here, down here have been some vets who've been actually climbed their way up the hill to have a look at Omaha Beach. And when we come back, we'll talk to them about what it was like for them at Omaha Beach 50 years ago. Morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
Nice to see you. Mr. Pirro, how are you? You mind staying around having a chat with us for a minute after we take a station break?
It's live?
What are you looking for?
Well, we're down on the road.
Right now, friends, between the dead and growing old and not wanting to remember.
Go ahead. Hey, you're going to the 50th, of course.
Out of the ocean, all you can see was ships.
I think of the men we lost here. I guess, wonder why
freedom. And you were born just 2 weeks after I left to come over here to England. And I go to a ball game when they play the Star Spangled Banner. I think of my brother John.
AT&T invites you to join us in saluting the true heroes of D-Day and all those who have fought for freedom.
I was getting worried that nobody know about it, that you wouldn't hear about it.
See Billy Graham with an important message tonight on WRTV6 at 8 p.m.
This Good Morning America ABC News special continues. Once again from St. Mary-Glaze, Joan London.
And good morning and welcome to our special ABC coverage of all the commemorative events going on this anniversary of D-Day. I am here in Saint-Mère-Église, which is a small French town that the American forces first liberated. And as you can hear, there's music going on behind me of that era for all the folks who stayed here while most people are over at the American Cemetery in Colville. And there are many, many veterans here, World War II veterans, and also many family and friends of those who fell here in the liberation of Normandy. And our geography editor is going to be along, Harm de Blay, and he will not only take a look at how it changed the course of the map in Europe, but also he will give us some personal remembrances of living under Nazi occupation in Holland. Right now, I'm going to go back to Omaha Beach, where Peter Jennings is staying by.
Except, Joan, you seem to get all the entertainment up there at St. Mary Glees. Is that a sort of swing band I hear behind you?
Yes, in fact, we've had some bands from the United States. One from Wisconsin was playing just a bit ago, but they've all been playing a lot of the songs that perhaps the GIs would have been listening to 50 years ago right now as they were fighting to liberate this small French town.
Well, let's listen for a second. Well, 50 years ago, of course, music had such an effect on the nation and had an effect on the war. All the songs were about Bugle Boy over there and How I'll Miss You When You're Gone. And, well, there's a whole history written in the Amerizik of the 1939 to 1945 period. This has been a very busy day here up and down along the Normandy coast. For those of you who've just joined us in the western part of the country, here's a brief look at what happened. The President this morning on board the USS George Washington, laying a wreath at sea to all those who died in the Normandy invasion, seeing him at sea and with some of the naval participants of the day is to remind ourselves just how enormous the naval armada was. And then he went to Pointe du Hoc and said thank you to the Rangers who scaled the cliffs at the western end of Omaha Beach. There's been several flyovers all day. This is part of the international ceremony on Omaha Beach today. The tricolor of so many flags in the world today, the French, the British, and of course the American. And then in all the streets of Normandy, up and down, which are now closed, all of the various participants who've come from 14 nations around the world to participate today as they did in the invasion 50 years ago. President Mitterrand spoke as the host nation here at the international ceremony. That's Queen Beatrice of the Netherlands. And in just a little while from now, we will be going up to the American cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer, Colville on the sea, on the English Channel to be precise, to hear President Clinton talk once again about the American contribution to the Normandy campaign. Joan?
Well, Peter, while all of the commemorative celebrations are going on here, there are a number of commemorations going on back in the United States, and also Spencer Christian is standing by in the childhood home of General Eisenhower, who's led all the Allied troops here in Europe. Spencer?
All right, Joan, good morning again.
Led all the Allied
years. The Eisenhower Library on these grounds here at the Eisenhower Center houses 22 million pages of various presidential and World War II documents. It's an amazing facility, and among the various things on display in there are not only documents from General Eisenhower and President Eisenhower, but also items sent in by individuals who participated in the war or who were related to folks who participated in the war. For example, we have here an unused, unopened carton of Lucky Strikes sent in by Fred Mueller of Wichita, Kansas. He served in the 2097 Quartermaster Truck Company. There's also a New Testament here, U.S. Army issue, that was sent in by Harry Cordell of Webster Grove, Missouri. Adolf Hitler, not library, but photo album, which includes many photos and articles on Adolf Hitler. That was sent in by John Dieter, former judge here, a retired judge here in Abilene. And of course, here on the corner, let us not forget the Uncle Sam, the famous I Want You, not only calling for your enlistment, but the Eisenhower Presidential Library here is enlisting your efforts to send in items dating back to the World War II era that you feel may be of interest to the library. If you have such items, give the library here a call or write them a letter. Let's take a look at today's weather across the states. It's going to be a nice sunny day over the plains, down into the southern Rockies and the southwest, out to the...
This Good Morning America ABC News special continues. Once again, Joan London.
The geography of Europe looked completely different 50 years ago. The German Empire covered a majority of the continent, and of course D-Day was really the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. And this morning we are going to take a closer look at what that historic day meant for all those living in Europe, many of whose countries were, of course, occupied by the Nazis. And I have with me our geography editor, Harm de Blay. who was actually living under Nazi occupation at that time, and I want to talk to you about that. But first of all, from a geographer's point of view, what did D-Day mean?
Well, as you can see from the map, Joan, the empire, the German Empire, the Third Reich, extended from Norway to North Africa, from Normandy to Moscow. It was an area with 200 million people in it, and it would have been one of the great empires of the future had it not been for the defeat of the Nazis, which started as this second map starts here, this entire area, with only Sweden and Switzerland really not part of the empire, and Spain and Portugal in a different situation. If you look what happened down here, already in Russia, in the Russian sphere, in the Soviet sphere, the Germans were losing considerably, and as you're also aware, right, and of course there had been an invasion in Italy before D-Day, but the key is that the fortifications and the strength of Germany was greatest here in the West, and that's where it had to happen. And so the third invasion, really the third rejection of German power, D-Day, with 150,000 troops and 11,000 planes and ships, that was the key to the final retreat of the German Empire. The map of Europe would have looked quite differently if that hadn't happened.
Absolutely. The biggest invasion in history, military history, but a great toll of lives over here as well.
2 million people, 2 million soldiers, German soldiers killed there.
You were where?
I lived in the Netherlands at the time. I was 5 years old when my hometown, Rotterdam, was bombed. I lived in a suburb of Rotterdam, and it's interesting. I remember almost nothing before that time and almost everything afterward.
We tend to forget what we'd like to forget,
That's right? That's right. And my parents moved us to a small village called Soesdijk in the center of Holland, where they thought it would be better. It would be a less urban scene, therefore less likely that you're going to get involved in this sort of thing again. Unfortunately, we wound up toward the end of the war between the retreating Germans and the advancing Allies, and for 3 weeks we were in a 12 by 12 foot basement as both sides rained bombs on the town.
So were you moved where you thought it would be safer? You had to wait even longer than everyone else to be liberated.
No one expected it to take this long. As you know, the Allies advanced into Belgium by September, and we thought it would be over by the end of the year. But for us, D-Day started the most horrific winter, the hunger winter, and then in September, Arnhem came and failed. And by the time it was the end of the war, my dad and I were no longer capable of walking. My mother was by far the strongest.
Really? And but could she go out safely to get you food? And
my mother did one of the most heroic things I could tell you from the war. She walked 150 miles to the northern part of Holland to get potatoes and turnips and beans, tied them in bags to her bicycle, and then walked all the way back. It took a week for that experience to take place. I figured by the end of the week that it was unlikely we'd ever see her again. And then one morning, at about 4 o'clock in the morning, there she was with the sustenance that saved us.
Do you remember all the bombs going off in the air?
Oh, there was no way you could not realize with the danger we were in. And with the no utilities, no water, literally it was a matter of touch and go. And I'm sure I represent thousands of families who are in a situation as bad or worse.
Who are scared young children, too, as you were.
That's right.
Harmon Abdullahi, thank you very much.
Thanks
and, of course, the map changing forever on that historic day, which we commemorate today. And we will be back with more of D-Day plus 50 in just a moment.
This Good Morning America ABC News special will continue in a moment.
Ceremonial southern end of the American cemetery, and for Americans, of course, it is this cemetery above Omaha Beach itself, which is the absolute centerpiece of attention here today. More than 9,000 Americans whose families decided that their loved ones should stay here and be buried on the land they liberated. In the cemetery, hundreds of people begin to gather now for what will be the last major ceremony of the day. President Clinton will speak about the American sacrifice here. Already many of the vets have gathered here. A very large crowd of veterans. They've been coming now for many weeks and months, bringing with them in some cases their children and their grandchildren, doing what we have tried to do here today in some way, and that is explain to people who were too young to remember, which is most of us in the United States, what it was like on that day for them, and also what it means for the nation and the world as a whole. Ultimately, the battle got off the beaches and into what's called the bocage of Normandy, these small pastures around which had been planted 100 years ago these tremendous hedgerows by Celtic farmers. And the Germans, whether they were the crack, fanatic, young Germans who believed that the Aryan German race was superior, or soldiers who'd fought on the Eastern Front and were here and exhausted and ill, or soldiers who were too tired because they'd been building the Atlantic Wall, fought with great ferocity. In a moment, we're going to talk to one of our visiting historians, Trevor Dupuy, about the battle inland and off the beach. But first, ABC's Jim Bitterman, who lives here in France, is going to take us to a small village here where there was incredibly bloody fighting, which not long ago decided to put together a record.
Lionel Martin is a French notary public. Gerard Lepauve is a laboratory technician. Jean-Jacques Rollin is a medical doctor.
Victorine, allez-y!
But in their part of Normandy, they might as well be Spielberg, Coppola, and Oliver Stone.
Clap!
Because for the past year, these three ordinary citizens, along with 300 volunteers, have spent nearly all their spare time working on the local version of The Longest Day. They all come from the area around the town of Mortain, scene of one of the last and one of the bloodiest battles in the liberation of Normandy. Germans had attacked and surrounded American troops of the 30th Infantry Division, who were temporarily surrounded. Only heavy bombing by the Air Force eventually saved members of an American battalion which refused to surrender. The story is a dramatic moment in the town's history. Hundreds of residents, including a woman who gave birth to a baby, spent nearly a week in an abandoned mine shaft while the fighting raged above. And then came the word from American soldiers that they had finally won and freed the town from the Nazis.
We thought we needed to keep alive the dramatic side of our history, the liberation of Normandy and of France. To make this film is important for coming generations.
But with a budget of $25,000, most of it going just to pay for film and processing, making the movie at all required more than a little ingenuity. Volunteers scoured the region to find collectors with old German and American uniforms and vehicles. Authenticity that for some was a little too real.
3 actors playing Gestapo officers were wearing genuine Gestapo uniforms. Everyone was taking a break when the shooting was over, and the 3 were spat upon and insulted by people reliving the experiences and not aware of the film.
Okay, je tourne.
To incorporate guns, tanks, and airplanes into their film, the amateur movie makers took their equipment and actors to museums and World War II monuments. But the trickiest part in a town of 2,000 people was to recruit and keep interested a cast of 300 unpaid characters weekend after weekend for an entire year.
What matters is that we ourselves learn many things about the battle. And those who played the parts of the Americans or the Germans or even of the civilians learned the history of Mortain in a way they never knew it before.
Finally, with the help of a film laboratory which donated time and editing assistance, the Battle of Mortain was ready for the big screen. The battle that took place in this little corner of Normandy may not be so well known as the D-Day landings, but it stood out in memories around here for more than half a century. And perhaps, thanks to the filmmakers of Mortain, it will live on even longer. Over the weekend, the hottest ticket in Mortain was an invitation to the premiere of the film. And when the credits finally rolled, it was clear that locally at least, the notary, the doctor, and the lab tech have a hit on their hands. Now showing in one theater, not very near you. Jim Bitterman, ABC News, Mortain, Normandy.
Well, and Jim said it too, the only place you can see the film currently is in Mortain, in Normandy. If you happen to be this way, it'll be worth your while. We'll be back in just a moment.
This Good Morning America ABC News special continues. Once again, from Omaha Beach, Peter Jennings.
In the American cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach, many of those who found their final resting place there died not just on the beach, but throughout the Normandy campaign. Joining us again is our visiting military historian, Colonel Trevor Dupuy, author of 90 books, graduate of West Point, former professor of military science at Harvard. Colonel Dupuy, when did the battle get up off the beach and move into the Norman countryside?
We got off the beach in the north, off Utah Beach, fairly quickly, Peter. That was thanks largely to the fact that the 2 airborne divisions had dropped in the general vicinity of Saint-Mère-Église, and that facilitated the landing of the 4th Division over Utah Beach. On Omaha Beach, it was very difficult. It was touch and go, and some people were still just barely off the beach by dark. The next morning, they began to push inland a little bit, but it was very difficult on Omaha.
Now, I have said, Colonel Dupuy, that whether they were the young, fanatical Germans or those who'd fought in the Eastern Front, the Germans fought particularly hard. In general terms, how tough was the battle up in the narrow lanes of Normandy?
The battle was a very tough one. The Germans were good. The Germans were the best soldiers in the world, I'm sorry to say. We were pretty good, but they were better. But we did well, we outnumbered them, and we drove them back.
But it took much longer than we'd anticipated, right?
It certainly did. We had, the anticipation was that we would be down close to Saint-Lô and beyond Caen in the first week, and we didn't get down there for over a month.
And am I right in recalling that the average German soldier was older than the American soldier?
I don't think so, Peter. I think that they were pretty close to the same age. They kept recruiting. Germany was beginning to drain its manpower barrel to the bottom, but nonetheless they were producing good soldiers.
And tell me very quickly, what's the tie you're wearing?
That is a British gunner's tie. I was the division artillery commander of the British 36th Division in Burma.
Is that the one for which the motto is, through the blood and blood to the blue skies beyond?
Yes, this is supposed to be the
Thank you, Colonel Dupuy. We'll be back.
Good evening, class. This is
Beaches of Normandy 50 years ago. President Clinton will be speaking. We'll also have more from here in Saint-Mère-Église as the commemoration ceremonies continue on this 50th anniversary of D-Day. They have music playing that is mindful of that era when our GIs were over here, for all the folks who stayed here in this small French town. Also coming up, entertainers from the legendary USO tours of World War II. Peter Jennings and I will be back.
Tonight.
I'm no fool, Joe.
But 50 years ago this morning, with a massive array of Navy guns at their back, the Allied forces stormed the beaches at Normandy. The battle for Normandy would go on for 2 months at a terrible cost. More than 200,000 casualties. Above Omaha Beach, the American cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer, 9,386 Americans are buried in the land they liberated.
This is a Good Morning America, ABC News Special. This is a Good Morning America, ABC News Special.
50 years later, President Clinton and the leaders of other nations whose soldiers fought and died here have come to honor them. So have thousands of survivors. Most only boys then, men in their 70s and 80s now, here to view once again the place where they fought.
It's supposed to be 16, number 46.
Some to search for a fallen comrade.
Now reporting from Saint-Mère-Église, Joan London.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to our special Good Morning America ABC News coverage of D-Day plus 50. We have been coming to you live from Normandy, France. I am in the small French town of Saint-Mère-Église, where all day long we've been hearing music that is mindful of the time when our GIs were over here liberating this small French town. And while some commemoration celebrations, you might say, are going on here, the official ceremonies are going on at the American Cemetery in Colville, and just down the beach on Omaha Beach, Peter Jennings is standing by. Peter?
Thank you, Jonah. Good morning, everybody. Again, there's another helicopter going by as we wait for the president to show up at the American Cemetery, which is just up on the top of the bluff. Beside us, we're reminded again of the constant air superiority that the United States and the other allied nations had on June the 6th D-Day. We were just looking at the figures. On June the 6th, the Allied Air Forces flew 14,674 missions and lost only 127 aircraft. The Germans flew 319 missions that day. None of them threatened the invasion fleet. You heard Admiral William Crowe, now the U.S. ambassador to Great Britain, talking a little earlier about one of Hitler's great mistakes. It was to give up on his fighter aircraft, wanting bombers to attack the British, and it was complete and utter air superiority that day for the Allied forces. It has been a very busy day for President Clinton, but this is quite likely to be the most moving portion of it, with Mrs. Clinton arriving at the American Military Cemetery, which of all the cemeteries in Normandy is far and away the most majestic. It has the cleanest lines. It was actually designed by a French architect, but with its sparkling white crosses, which you've seen and you'll see again in a couple of minutes, it gives off a vibrancy that you do not find in the other cemeteries here, which are in many ways much more intimate. The President has arrived, Mrs. Clinton, the American ambassador to France is here, the Secretary of State, you just saw Warren Christopher, the Secretary of Defense is here, William Perry, the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, a great many people in the official entourage, and an enormous crowd gathered in this cemetery, which has been crowded for many weeks now by returning veterans and their children and grandchildren. There is, quite frankly, for those of us of a certain age, nothing more moving than seeing a vet of World War II come with a generation and then another generation and try to explain what really happened here, because Normandy today is a clean and pristine summer vacation or year-round recreation. There, by the way, is Congressman Gibbons, Sam Gibbons, just in the left of your picture there. He's likely to take over the, in fact, has taken over the chairmanship of the House Ways and Means Committee. But he was a paratrooper here, Sam Gibbons, with the 501st element of the 101st Airborne, and he jumped into Normandy. Right there at the left of your picture, he'll become a more familiar figure as the healthcare reform debate continues in Washington. But for today, he is a man we know as someone who jumped in to Normandy, bringing with him 2 cans of Schlitz beer when he jumped. Now, the cemetery here, which is administered, which is a small piece of American territory administered by the U.S. Battlefield and Monuments Commission, is absolutely crowded with people today, as all of the cemeteries are crowded. Earlier today, Queen Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh went to the very beautiful British cemetery and paid tribute there. We'll show you that in a little while. The Germans came here a couple of days ago to their cemetery and paid tribute to their comrades. And then American vets and German vets got together here in the American cemetery and then in the German cemetery. There is, as we've said very often today, not much celebration here today. It's not that everybody's somber about it, but it is much more an opportunity for commemoration. And as our White House correspondent Britt Hume was telling us a little earlier, for President Clinton, who was too young for World War II, like virtually other political leader here, a quite exciting, adventurous journey through the past as he thanks an earlier generation for helping the rest of us live free. David Brinkley is in the cemetery with us. David, what kind of a day has it been up there? Because you've seen much more in the cemetery than we have.
I can't hear you because the helicopter is immediately over my head. I can't hear anything. And if I said anything, you couldn't hear it. So, anyway, you've been talking about the 102nd Airborne. I think its history is interesting. Since D-Day, Eisenhower became president. He sent the 102nd to Little Rock, Arkansas to help integrate Central High School. Well, I am talking whether you can hear it or not.
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
The helicopter's immediately overhead. That was its last public service until now. Last military operation of the 102nd was to integrate Central High School. I don't know if you heard this before or not. Integrate Central High School in Little Rock. Now they're here and they look wonderful, and they're one of the great military outfits of the world. Very proud lot, and justifiably so.
President and Mrs. Clinton signing the visitor's book at this cemetery. Colville, this particular location of the cemetery, was a U.S. 1st Division objective on D-Day. And in just a short period of time, the President, Mrs. Clinton, and his entourage will come out again to this truly magnificent place where the President will speak to the vets, their families, the visitors from 14 nations, and to the rest of us about the sacrifice made here. We'll be back in just a moment.
This Good Morning America ABC News special continues. Once again, Peter Jennings.
Well, there's so much more to talk about, Normandy. There's the battle inland, and we'll talk about that. We have with us our noted historian, Trevor Dupuy, who'll tell us, much to the surprise of people who grew up thinking otherwise, how good the Germans were. Henry Graff is with us from Columbia University to talk about the home front. The great thing about World War II is how unified the nation was, how much people sacrificed at home to make it possible over here. Widely believed by virtually every historian that it was the sheer weight of American production that made the final months, particularly of the war, such a success. After all, Britain had been in the war since 1939. America didn't come in until after Pearl Harbor, but what a difference it made in terms of the liberation of Europe. The British fighting in Europe for a long time, fighting in Africa, fighting in the Middle East. This morning, Queen Elizabeth II and the Duke of Edinburgh, who'd come over here in the Royal Yacht Britannia, went to this very lovely British cemetery to pay tribute to the troops there. With her again, Francois Mitterrand, the President of France, who has been the host for everybody here. It's very, very different than the American cemetery, and you cannot miss a British vet. They all wear blue blazers and gray flannel trousers, no matter what the unit, and they all wear either their berets, you can see them in the foregrounds there, depending upon what their regimental affiliation was. In the heat of battle very often during World War II, many British commanders simply refused to wear a steel helmet. They preferred to wear their berets. In some cases, you see the Highland regiments wearing their Glengarries, the cap, sort of peak cap, which goes with the kilt. But this, of course, was an Allied invasion. The British were responsible for 2 beaches here, Golden Sword. They had an easier time than the Americans did on Omaha Beach. They got inland quicker, they got up over the seawall, and were fighting in the actual interior of Normandy before the Americans got off the beach at Omaha. But there is this tremendous union here of what it was like 50 years ago in wartime Britain. 1.5 million Americans in wartime Britain before they came across the Channel. Here, 100 miles across here, not at the narrowest point, as the Germans had always thought. Now we're talking a little bit about the home front. We're joined again by the former professor of history at Columbia University, Professor Emeritus, I guess you are now, Henry Graff. Tell us a little bit about what it was like at home in those days. Were people really feeling the sacrifice, or did everybody feel it all together?
Peter, the goal was victory, V for victory, and the great hope as the country came out of a depression, the worst depression in history, was that there would be a better life after the war. There were none of the elegant war aims of the First World War period. It was victory, and the public was united. I think the public was encouraged to save things, just to give them a sense of participation, because we were the only country of the major belligerents untouched physically by the war. We saved cloth. I think that was the end of the vest for men's suits. Pleated skirts went by the board because straight skirts would take less in the way of yardage.
Cuffs on men's trousers disappeared?
Cuffs on men's trousers disappeared. I must tell you also that one of the great irritations of Americans, the withholding tax, was introduced during the war, and that was probably a very good idea because the war was paid for very significantly by taxation and not by borrowing, and that tended to keep inflation down, and as shortages did develop, it prevented the rise of terrible inflation, and that was much in the minds of the Americans because they remembered what had happened in Germany at the end of the First World War.
You were talking about the Depression. It really was the production of the war. I was just looking at some of the figures. From 1940 to the end of the war, 300,000 military aircraft produced, 89,000 tanks, 3 million machine guns. The war really helped to pull America out of the Depression, didn't it?
There's no question. And one of the effects was to make the New Deal look good, which up to that time it had not. And that certainly strengthened Franklin Roosevelt's hand as a leader. I listened before to Alan mentioning Roosevelt's name, how little Roosevelt has been recalled during this commemoration.
Henry, thanks very much. It's nice to hear your voice again. Alan Brinkley is also with us. He was too young at the time of the war, but Alan, you've managed to put this into such geopolitical perspective for us. I'm struck by how all the positions have changed. The Russians were our allies, then our enemies, now our allies. The Germans are our allies again. What do you make of this new world disorder?
Well, I'm not sure I know much more about what to make of it than anyone else, including people who are making foreign policy at the moment. But it does seem to me that thinking of D-Day in connection with the world we know today, D-Day is really the moment, at least symbolically, of the Americanization of Europe. Even though there were more British and Canadian troops that actually landed on the beaches on D-Day itself, within about a week or two, there was an overwhelming preponderance of American forces in Western Europe. It had, of course, been the Americans who had been the most energetic at promoting D-Day before the invasion. And it was an American war in Europe from this moment on. And, of course, it was an American world after the war. And now we're at a point when we don't know whose world it's going to be.
You were saying a little earlier to me, perhaps not on the television this morning, that you thought that Stalin's resentment of the resistance of Americans and the British to go sooner with the Western frontier led to increased the antipathy of the Cold War.
Well, certainly Stalin bitterly resented what he considered an unconscionable delay in opening the Second Front, and complained constantly to Roosevelt and Churchill about why they weren't moving more quickly. Whether an earlier invasion would have changed the character of the Cold War is hard to say, but it certainly was one of the irritants to the relationship during the war itself.
Winston Churchill we're looking at now with Dwight Eisenhower reminds me of a story which I'll tell you in 1 minute about Winston Churchill wanting to come to the front. But Alan, put the casualties in perspective for us, because while we're commemorating D-Day, this was not in the annals of war the bloodiest of days by any means.
No, you said earlier there were bloodier battles in World War I, and in the American Civil War, which is one of the bloodiest wars in modern history, there were 23,000 casualties in 1 day at Antietam. There were 40,000 casualties in 4 days at Gettysburg. And even though there were terrible casualties here on the beaches at Normandy, they were nothing compared to that, a tiny percentage.
Okay, thank you both. Alan Brinkley and Henry Graff will be one to you. But I did want to tell you the story about Churchill. Both Churchill and Hitler thought they knew a lot about military campaigning. Their senior commanders didn't always think so. But Churchill was absolutely determined that he was going to come on the invasion. And General Eisenhower, who was the commander of all the Allied forces, said under no circumstances. And Churchill said, well, I'll come on a ship and I'll sit in the middle of the channel. And Eisenhower clearly didn't want him around. Among other things, he was too valuable to the war effort at home. And Churchill kept insisting. And he said to Eisenhower, but you're not in charge now, are you, of all British people who serve in this war? And General Eisenhower said, no, I wasn't. He said, then I'll talk to somebody and they'll put me on a ship as a British citizen. The only thing that Eisenhower could do was go to King George VI and beg his help. And King George VI went to Churchill, Prime Minister Churchill, and said, well, if you want to go, then I'll go too. Well, Churchill's conscience finally got to him, and he thought the king was too valuable to risk out there in the middle of the Armada, and so he stayed at home, but it was touch and go for just a while. We'll be back in just a moment.
To order a video cassette version of D-Day Plus 50, use your Visa or MasterCard and call 1-800-913-3434. Once again, live from Omaha Beach, Peter Jennings.
Welcome back to our coverage of the D-Day ceremonies here. The focal point at the moment is the American Cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer. It's just up the hill from there to the west of us. It's not a new cemetery. It was inaugurated in 1956 by then General George Marshall and by President Coty of France. 9,386 American war dead are buried here. It's not a small cemetery, 172 acres, 9,386 American war dead buried here. As we said, Colville was a U.S. First Division objective on D-Day. On each of these crystal clear white marble crosses, or in many cases the Star of David, etched in the white marble the name, the unit, the age of the young man who died, and they were all young. And sometimes, but very rarely, you can see the cross itself has got the lettering in gold. This is most unusual. Theodore Roosevelt Jr., Congressional Medal of Honor winner, Brigadier General in the U.S. Army from New York. But in every other cross or Star of David, the carving is only in the marble itself with no coloration, except when families come here. And then they're encouraged by the people who run the cemetery to get a handful of sand from Omaha Beach and come and rub it in the name. And the name comes out in relief on the white marble and makes a photograph for them to take home. They have come from every state of the Union, of course. So many of them have brought their wives. A great many of them have been here before. They just, as they don't have this identifying feature that the British have of wearing blue blazers and their berets, they're a little harder to see, but they're all wearing passes for this particular weekend, which makes them very privileged people in France, as they should be, because the French bureaucracy here has made it enormously difficult to get from one place to another. One day a road is open one direction, the next day it's open another. But everywhere they have been celebrated, even in some cases by the Normans, who did not always appreciate what happened to this little section of France for them, either under the German occupation or during the liberation. You heard mentioned much earlier on that there was tremendous destruction when the Allied forces came ashore. Mrs. Clinton, who has been at her husband's side all day and has had no particular individual opportunities of her own to get out and meet people, though the other day she did get a chance to meet some young French. Mrs. Clinton also, of course, of that generation which was too young for the war. Really skipped a generation in some ways. David Brinkley was saying to us early the great imprint that the leaders of World War II, in almost all facets of our national life, made on American society. Look at that. That takes you back. Flying Fortress. Lancaster bomber in the lead, Flying Fortress behind, Spitfires, I think, or maybe Mustangs to the left or to the right. 12,000, 14,000 missions flown by the Allied Air Forces just on June the 6th. Now look up at the sky and imagine that 9 miles across they were, 100 feet between every wingtip, and they just covered the sky. You couldn't see the English Channel for all the ships. You couldn't see the sky for all the aircraft. This is an important speech for President Clinton, of course. It is inevitable that he today will be compared in some small measure, perhaps, not enormous measure, to the visit here on the 40th anniversary by Ronald Reagan, who made that famous speech about the boys at Pointe de Hoc, which simply means hook point. It is not just Americans who gathered in the cemetery today. The commingling or the intermingling of the Allies has really been something to behold. There have been a lot of people here who simply admire the military or who like to play war games dressed up in uniforms. We talked to some on top of our bunker here the other day, dressed up in World War II uniforms. They turned out to be from Czechoslovakia, or what used to be Czechoslovakia. There again you see DKWs, the ducks, part of the amphibious operation, and the weather's just about the same. They're going out into the surf now. Again, they've been out once and are coming back. Now there's a very light sea here today, of course. 50 years plus one day ago, the English Channel was such a ferocious body of water that General Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, delayed the invasion. And even on D-Day, they weren't sure that the weather would hold.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States, accompanied by General George Dowling, Supreme Allied Commander, Europe. By General George Dowling, Supreme Allied Commander, Europe.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. It's our pleasure to recognize our official distinguished visitors joining us today. We extend a special welcome to the D-Day and World War II veterans in attendance who honor us all by their presence. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to present our Master of Ceremonies, Mr. Walter Cronkite.
One of America's most familiar faces, one of America's nicest guys, who was here in World War II.
Walter Cronkite has covered nearly every major news event during his 44-year affiliation with CBS, including 14 years as anchorman on the CBS Evening News. But it was as a United Press correspondent that Mr. Cronkite covered World War II, including taking part in the beachhead assault in Normandy 50 years ago today. Mr. Cronkite, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. President, Mrs. Clinton, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and the honored of today, our veterans. 50 years ago today, the liberation of Western Europe began on these beaches here at Normandy. The greatest invasion force in history landed here to open the final stage of World War II in Europe. I'm honored to have been asked to share with you this solemn and historic commemoration. For this great Allied undertaking, more than 70,000 American soldiers, sailors, and airmen overcame tremendous odds to secure these beaches. However, we're not here to celebrate, nor are we here certainly to glorify battle. Our purpose today is to remember and to say thank you once again to the veterans who stand before us and who lie around us here. Each of us has our own memories of this land. As we relive them with families and friends, this beautiful and this peaceful countryside of today masks the horrors of a half-century ago. We remember the men, we remember the sacrifice of life, the willingness to risk everything to restore freedom and peace to a country that many who landed on these beaches had only up to then read about in their history books. Sadly, many of them were experiencing again the stories from an earlier conflict, stories of fathers and uncles who had fought in this land barely a quarter of a century before. For each of us here, the memories return. We look to each of the veterans who has returned and say again, thanks. We look to the white markers which surround us out there and say thanks. Thanks that we stand here today in peace and in friendship on beaches once littered with death and filled with the terror of dying. Today, we honor the veterans of this battle and remind ourselves of the great price paid to secure peace and freedom here. But before the formal portion of the commemoration begins, we wish to thank all of the organizations and the individuals who have dedicated time and effort to make this day a reality. We'd like to offer a special welcome, of course, to all the veterans and their families who have traveled so far to share this day. I came here on this trip by ship, honored to share the passage with several hundred veterans. I was surprised to learn that many, perhaps most, had kept silent on their exploits. A half-century of silence, even with their families. And I was somewhat puzzled by that until I realized that these men did not feel that they should reap the glory just because they survived. It was, they felt, their comrades who didn't make it, who were the true heroes. Let me assure those who are here and those thousands who could not get back to Normandy for this commemoration that to us, whose liberty and freedom you assured, that you indeed are heroes, each and every one. This day, 50 years ago, changed the world. Its legacy remains for my generation as well as for all generations to come, a symbol of the true cost of peace and freedom. May the short while that we share here today help inscribe in the annals of time the memory of those who died, along with those who survived, and who together shall live forever. It's now time to begin the ceremony. If you'll please rise for the posting of the colors.
Ladies and gentlemen, the invocation delivered by Major General Matthew A. Zimmerman, Chief of Chaplains, United States Army.
May we bow our heads in prayer. O God, by whose grace we gain courage to walk the same road as the heroes of faith, we lift our hearts in gratitude for all who lived valiantly, and certainly for all who died bravely for truth, for liberty, and for righteousness. But especially do we thank you for the heroes of this beach, those who suffered and tasted bitter sacrifice in achieving the freedom that we enjoy so much today. So God of our fathers, help us to prize very highly and to guard very carefully the gifts which their loyalty and devotion have passed on to us. grant unto us the gift of a living and vigorous faith, that we too may be like them, that we may be true as they were true, that we may be loyal as they were loyal, and that we may serve our country and the cause of freedom all the days of our lives. We pray that in the final day, we might join those soldiers we remember here in wearing the victor's crown. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States will now place a wreath on the memorial in honor of those who served and those who made the supreme sacrifice. He's assisted by two D-Day veterans, Mr. Walter Ehlers, Medal of Honor recipient, 1st Infantry Division, and Colonel Alvin Ungerleider of the 29th Infantry Division.
Staff Sergeant Walter Ehlers lost his brother on Omaha Beach, as we said earlier. That's him on the left, and Colonel Ungerleider from the 29th Infantry Division on the right. The only unit his was to receive the Presidential Citation on D-Day. The wreath to be laid at the foot of the statue at the eastern end of the cemetery, representing the spirit of American youth rising out of the sea. This is a 21-gun salute fired from the bluff at the edge of the cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach. Overlooking the beaches on an overcast day, not all dissimilar from what it was then. two very brave men accompanying the president. Not all the men who arrived on these beaches 50 years ago were brave. Some of them were so terrified they couldn't move, but these were very brave.
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General John Saakashvili.
General Saakashvili not long ago replaced Colin Powell, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and earlier today you heard from Admiral William Crowe on this broadcast, another Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, each of whom in his own way has served the nation both as a military and to a large degree a political officer.
President and Mrs. Clinton, Ambassador Harriman, heroes of Normandy and of World War II, members of Congress, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, fellow soldiers. 50 years ago today, at an observation post on the bluffs overlooking Omaha Beach, just over there, German Lieutenant Friedrich Werking watched as the fog lifted from the channel and exposed for the very first time the vast armada of ships that literally filled the horizon. In utter disbelief, he could only mutter, "That's not possible. It's not possible." And standing at the bow of one of the landing craft, heading towards Omaha Beach, was the man I have the great pleasure of introducing today. He was in the first wave, and as befits a company commander, he was the first one off the boat, followed closely by his communication sergeant and the company clerk. The other 30 men on his boat never got out. He scrambled to the seawall, and years later, when he recalled his feelings as he assembled the survivors of the other boats, he said, "Utter chaos reigned, because the enemy controlled the field of fire so completely. There was nothing I could do on that beach except die." But he was not destined to die that day. Rather, this battle-hardened veteran of 3 campaigns in North Africa, with extraordinary courage, led his men over the seawall, through the minefield, off the beach, and up the bluff, engaging the enemy every tortuous step of the way, thus achieving the very first breakout of U.S. troops from that deadly beachhead. He and his men not only helped relieve the intensity of hostile fire against the beaches below, but by their inspiring example, convinced the thousands of men still on the beach that they too could make it up the bluff. By mid-afternoon, Gulf Company's 16th Regiment, 1st Division, had advanced to the west side of Colville, the deepest advance that day. Theirs was that very critical first step in a march to final victory. Now, in 1944, the Associated Press observed that when history books are written, about the great invasion of France, you may not necessarily read of Joe Dawson, but it's so correctly concluded that no history will be complete without him. And he's here with us today representing the thousands of soldiers who fought on this very soil. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great privilege to introduce to you the then commanding officer of G Company, 16th Regiment, the Big Red One, winner of the Distinguished Service Cross for that action that day, a great American hero, Joseph T. Dawson.
He said it all about Joe Dawson.
In the face of crisis, men rise above themselves to accomplish great things. Here on this hallowed ground is where the battle was joined. What better examples of courage and bravery were ever displayed than by the men of the assault elements of the 16th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Division and the men of the 116th Infantry Regiment of the 29th Division, who were our comrades here on Omaha Beach, June the 6th, 1944. I cannot tell you what it means to me to stand on this spot where the path we took led us to where we are today. Where we landed at 0700 on the beach below was total chaos. Men lay dead or dying, and the equipment and wreckage of battle was choking the shoreline. I recall how I was overwhelmed with a feeling of anger and hate, and I knew we had to get to the enemy before we were destroyed. Suddenly I saw a path blocked with obstacles and obviously mine, leading toward the crest of the bluff that dominated this beach. Upon clearing the minefield, we swiftly moved to engage the enemy entrenched here on the crest. By sheer luck, or perhaps by fate, we found the opening that became the first penetration of the enemy. The path we cleared became the route of our comrades to follow, and it was the only exit off the beach until later that day. We're here to recognize and to pay homage to those who shaped the course of history. Only one who holds the highest office in this land can express to the world the pride and gratitude of our nation to you, the men of D-Day. And so on behalf of the soldiers of my company and all other Army warriors who stormed these beaches and bluffs, and on behalf of our Navy, Coast Guard, and Air Force comrades who fought with us and for us, on behalf of all men and women who served their country in World War II, it is my special privilege and great honor to present the President of the United States.
The World War II generation introducing the 1960s generation. Joe Dawson from Texas. What a day he must have had here 50 years ago.
Mr. Dawson, you did your men proud today. General Shalikashvili, Mr. Cronkite, Chaplain, distinguished leaders of our government, members of Congress, members of the armed services, our hosts from France, and most of all, our veterans, their families, and their friends. In these last days of ceremonies, we have heard wonderful words of tribute. Now we come to this hallowed place that speaks more than anything else in silence. Here on this quiet plateau, on this small piece of American soil, we honor those who gave their lives for us 50 crowded years ago. Today, the beaches of Normandy are calm. If you walk these shores on a summer's day, all you might hear is the laughter of children playing on the sand, or the cry of seagulls overhead, or perhaps the ringing of a distant church bell. The simple sounds of freedom barely breaking the silence. Peaceful sounds. Ordinary sounds. But June 6, 1944 was the least ordinary day of the 20th century. On that chill dawn, these beaches echoed with the sounds of staccato gunfire, the roar of aircraft, the thunder of bombardment. And through the wind and the waves came the soldiers out of their landing craft and into the water, away from their youth and toward a savage place many of them would sadly never leave. They had come to free a continent. The Americans, the British, the Canadians, the Poles, the French resistance, the Norwegians, and others. They had all come to stop one of the greatest forces of evil the world has ever known. As news of the invasion broke, back home in America, people held their breath. In Boston, commuters stood reading the news on the electric sign at South Station. In New York, the Statue of Liberty, its torch blacked out since Pearl Harbor, was lit at sunset for 15 minutes. And in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, a young mother named Pauline Elliott wrote to her husband Frank, a corporal in the Army, "D-Day has arrived. The first thought of all of us was a prayer." Below us are the beaches where Corporal Elliott's battalion and so many other Americans landed. Omaha and Utah, proud names from America's heartland, part of the biggest gamble of the war, the greatest crusade, yes, the longest day. During those first hours on bloody Omaha, nothing seemed to go right. Landing craft were ripped apart by mines and shells. Tanks sent to protect them had sunk, drowning their crews. Enemy fire raked the invaders as they stepped into chest-high water and waded past the floating bodies of their comrades. And as the stunned survivors of the first wave huddled behind a seawall, it seemed the invasion might fail. Hitler and his followers had bet on it. They were sure the Allied soldiers were soft, weakened by liberty and leisure, by the mingling of races and religion. They were sure their totalitarian youth had more discipline and zeal. But then something happened. Although many of the American troops found themselves without officers on unfamiliar ground, next to soldiers they didn't know, one by one they got up. They inched forward, and together, in groups of 3s and 5s and 10s, the sons of democracy improvised and mounted their own attacks. At that exact moment, on these beaches, the forces of freedom turned the tide of the 20th century. These soldiers knew that staying put meant certain death, but they were also driven by the voice of free will and responsibility, nurtured in Sunday schools, town halls, and sandlot ball games. The voice that told them to stand up and move forward, saying, You can do it, and if you don't, no one else will. And as Captain Joe Dawson led his company up this bluff, and as others followed his lead, they secured a foothold for freedom. Today, many of them are here among us. Oh, they may walk with a little less spring in their step, and their ranks are growing thinner. But let us never forget, when they were young, these men saved the world. And so let us now ask them, all the veterans of the Normandy campaign, to stand if they can and be recognized. The freedom they fought for was no abstract concept. It was the stuff of their daily lives. Listen to what Frank Elliott had written to his wife from the embarkation point in England. I miss hamburgers a la Coney Island, American beer a la Duquesne, American shows a la Penn Theater, and American girls a la you. Pauline Elliott wrote back on June 6th as she and their one-year-old daughter listened on the radio. Little Deronda is the only one not affected by D-Day news. I hope and pray she will never remember any of this, but only the happiness of the hours that will follow her daddy's homecoming step on the porch. Well, millions of our GIs did return home from that war to build up our nations and enjoy life's sweet pleasures. But on this field, there are 9,386 who did not. 33 pairs of brothers, a father and his son, 11 men from tiny Bedford, Virginia, and Corporal Frank Elliott, killed near these bluffs by a German shell on D-Day. They were the fathers we never knew, the uncles we never met, the friends who never returned, the heroes we can never repay. They gave us our world. And those simple sounds of freedom we hear today are their voices speaking to us across the years. At this place, let us honor all the Americans who lost their lives in World War II. Let us remember as well that over 40 million human beings from every side perished, soldiers on the field of battle, Jews in the ghettos and death camps, civilians ravaged by shell fire and famine. May God give rest to all their souls. 50 years later, what a different world we live in. Germany, Japan, and Italy, liberated by our victory, now stand among our closest allies and the staunchest defenders of freedom. Russia, decimated during the war and frozen afterward in communism and Cold War, has been reborn in democracy. And as freedom rings from Prague to Kiev, the liberation of this continent is nearly complete. Now the question falls to our generation. How will we build upon the sacrifice of D-Day's heroes? Like the soldiers of Omaha Beach, we cannot stand still. We cannot stay safe by doing so. Avoiding today's problems would be our own generation's appeasement. For just as freedom has a price, it also has a purpose, and its name is progress. Today, our mission is to expand freedom's reach farther, to tap the full potential of each of our own citizens, to strengthen our families, our faith, and our communities, to fight indifference and intolerance, to keep our nation strong, and to light the lives of those still dwelling in the darkness of undemocratic rule. Our parents did that and more. We must do nothing less. They struggled in war so that we might strive in peace. We know that progress is not inevitable, but neither was victory upon these beaches. Now as then, the inner voice tells us to stand up and move forward. Now as then, free people must choose. 50 years ago, the first Allied soldiers to land here in Normandy came not from the sea, but from the sky. They were called pathfinders, the first paratroopers to make the jump. Deep in the darkness, they descended upon these fields to light beacons for the airborne assault that would soon follow. Now, near the dawn of a new century, the job of lighting those beacons falls to our hands. To you who brought us here, I promise, we will be the new pathfinders, for we are the children of your sacrifice. Thank you, and God bless you all.
And surely it is appropriate that the sun has broken through on this important day.
Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the benediction delivered by Rear Admiral David T. White, Chief of Chaplains, United States Navy.
Please join with me in our prayer of benediction. Let us pray. God of grace and God of glory, our nation was founded by brave souls who declared their reliance on your divine providence and who pledged to each other their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. Here in this hallowed place, we are humbled, O God, and knowing that the heritage we enjoy as a people was not simply given, but was secured through the sacrifice of those who shared their youth and lifeblood to defend and give heart to a nation. Therefore, we give thanks for the common heritage of freedoms we enjoy and the uncommon valor and sacrifice that have preserved them for us, as on this day we offer our profound gratitude for heroes proved in liberating strife, who more than self their country loved, and mercy more than life. And now, O God, endow us in our day with that spirit which prizes liberty as the heritage of all humanity, so that we may keep faith with those who have gone before us and acquit ourselves with honor as we take the torch of freedom into tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. Amen.
Please remain standing for the national anthems of France and the United States, followed by an honorary flyover.
And with the final fly past over the cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer, we invite Joan London, who led us share Good Morning America, Joan, today with some final thoughts.
Peter, as we leave Normandy, I think we will all be touched by the feeling of fraternity between the French and the Americans, with the American flag flying everywhere. And you certainly cannot leave this town without the feeling, and this part of Normandy without the feeling that we should never, never forget that lesson in history, which is to never forget.
Thank you, Joan, and thank you for allowing us to share Good Morning America with you this morning. 50 years after so much blood was spilled in this small corner of the world, there have been any number of words spilled here today about what it all meant. But surely the President said it all when he said that 50 crowded years ago, young men of so many nations, sons of democracy for the most part, left their youth and to save the world. The President also made several references there to the Elliott family, Pauline and Frank Elliott, young man from Ohio who came to fight at Omaha Beach. A much fuller version of their letters can be heard and seen tonight, illustrated on the ABC News program, Day One. Thank you for joining us here at Normandy today. For all of the people who joined me, I'm Peter Jennings. A grateful nation remembers.
Hey, Lois.
Clark, where you been?
Oh, you know, around.
Well, guess who was just here?
Right. Blue tights, red cape, flies. Seen him.
Oh, look who's jealous.
Jealous? Just because you have a schoolgirl crush on some guy who jumps around in a pair of pajamas. I am not out of this game yet. You just watch.
Sunday at 8.
And you can catch it only on WRTV6, Making a Difference for Indiana.